The stories. The motel room safe with a secret ledger. The motel sat just off a two-lane highway that curved through a stretch of desert where radio stations faded to static. The sign still buzzed faintly, a few letters missing so that it read asterisk, Elton Mo L asterisk. For years, the rooms had been rented mostly to truckers, traveling salesmen, and people who didn't want their names on a record. But in the spring of 2011, a part-time maintenance worker named Vince Daly age 42, came across something in room 12 that would change how the place was remembered. Vince wasn't an ambitious man. He fixed air conditioners, mowed the patchy grass, and replaced broken keys. On that particular morning, he was there to remove a faulty safe from under the dresser. It had been locked for years, ever since the manager before last passed away. The new owner told him to
cut it open so the space could finally be rented again. Inside was a single object, a small black ledger, its edges curled and faintly sticky, as if something had spilled on it long ago. The front cover had no name, no label, just a thumbprint stain. Vince assumed it was nothing. Maybe a guest had used it to keep receipts. He tossed it in his tool bag and went on with his work. Later that evening, curiosity got the better of him. He opened the ledger while sitting at the counter of a diner across the road. The first few pages were normal lists of initials, dates, dollar amounts, but halfway through, the tone shifted. Names were written in full, alongside words like balance cleared and returned. Some lines had stars next to them, and others were crossed out entirely. Near the back, he saw a series of entries dated between 1984 and 1987, all under a heading written in shaky block letters, collections room 12. Asterisk, asterisk. At first, Vince thought it might have been a motel expense log, but a few of the names seemed familiar. One matched a woman whose picture still hung behind the front desk, a former housekeeper who disappeared decades ago. He mentioned it the next day to Marlene Greer, the daytime manager, who shrugged and said old records were full of ghost entries. Still, something in her expression told him she wasn't entirely surprised. Over the next few days, Vince couldn't let it go. He went to the county library and looked through microfilm archives of local newspapers. In late August of 1986, he found a short article about a missing motel employee named Carla Mendez. The story said she'd last been seen leaving work after a night shift, carrying the deposit bag for the week's earnings. Police assumed robbery, but no suspect was ever found. That name Carla was written 3 times in the ledger, each next to the same date. August 22, 1986. One entry read, final balance, then ledger closed. The coincidence was too clean to ignore. Vince took photocopies of the pages and showed them to a retired sheriff's deputy he knew, Alton McCrae, who had worked the area back then. Alton took one look and went quiet. After a moment, he said the handwriting reminded him of Ray Weller, the motel owner in the 80s. Weller had died in 1992 after his car went off a canyon road. No foul play suspected, just bad brakes and too much whiskey. Alton said there were rumors Weller used the motel as a front for short-term loans cash advances to locals who couldn't go through a bank. The ledger might have been his way of keeping track of who owed what. The crossed-out names, he explained, could mean debts paid. Or something worse. Vince started noticing how people reacted when he mentioned the find. Some locals would change the subject. Others told him not to dig. The place had been losing business for years, and nobody wanted reporters sniffing around. But he couldn't shake the thought that someone might still care about what happened to Carla Mendez. He tracked down her sister, Isabel, who still lived 2 towns over. When he showed her the ledger, she didn't even touch it. She just said, "We already tried for 25 years. Nobody cared then. They won't now." Before leaving, she pointed at one of the other names, asterisk, asterisk, P. Larkin. Asterisk, asterisk. He was a regular there, she said. Used to drink with the owner. Ask the bartender from that time if he's still alive. Vince found asterisk asterisk Pete Larkin asterisk asterisk listed in a 2020 phone directory. He was living in a nursing facility about 30 miles away. When Vince called, the man's memory was fading, but one thing stuck. There was cash, Larkin said. Every weekend, people paid what they owed. Weller called it the 12 Club. Said if you didn't pay up, you checked out for good. It sounded like drunken talk, but when Vince returned to the ledger, he realized that almost all entries labeled cleared were tied to weekends. One page listed the amount 500 next to C. Mendez, and a note, asterisk asterisk, handled in 12. Asterisk asterisk. At this point, the facts that remained were simple. Carla disappeared on August 22nd, 1986. Weller's ledger mentioned her by name that same day. Weller died 6 years later in what might have been an accident, and now, decades later, his motel still stood, barely operating, with a safe no one had opened until Vince cut it loose. He reported everything to the local sheriff's office. They took the ledger as evidence, but nothing came of it for months. Then, in early October of 2012, a construction crew working on a new drainage ditch behind the property uncovered partial human remains. Dental records confirmed they belonged to Carla Mendez. The investigation was reopened. Forensic teams matched residue from the ledger's pages to soil found at the burial site. Both contained the same rare industrial solvent used in the motel's janitorial supplies during the 80s. It wasn't enough to convict anyone, but it closed a circle. The 12 Club wasn't a rumor. It was bookkeeping for threats carried out. By the time the motel finally shut down, Vince had long quit. He moved north, took a job maintaining cabins at a lakeside resort, and stopped talking about what he'd found. Reporters wrote short pieces calling it the Ledger case, and then it faded again into local legend. Years later, when the building was demolished, one last item turned up in the rubble, a second, safe, smaller, newer, but sealed tight. Inside, they found only a key-tagged asterisk asterisk room 12. Copy. Asterisk asterisk nothing else, no pages, no ledgers, just that key. Placed deliberately. People who'd worked there guessed Vince had planted it, a quiet nod to what he'd uncovered, but those who knew him said he wouldn't have done that. He hated attention. Maybe it was Weller's doing, a strange joke meant to outlast him. Either way, the motel's sign was gone, the ground was leveled, and the highway kept humming like nothing had ever happened. Still, sometimes at night, when the wind passes through the empty lot, locals say you can hear the faint rattle of a loose metal door like an old safe settling back into silence. Whether that's true or not hardly matters. What stayed was the story, and the proof that even the most ordinary places can keep ledgers of their own. The stories. Why locals avoided that church basement after the flood. The church sat on a low rise beyond the river curve, and everyone still called it a safe hill. Neighbors said the floodwater reached the stained steps anyway, and the basement stayed damp long after the river fell. Clara Vass, 34, worked as a field insurance adjuster who took pictures, typed notes, and kept calm voices moving. She drove into the town after the levee break, aiming to document damage and close claims before tempers soured. Her goal for that day was simple: confirm a cluster of small claims tied to the hilltop church. The first change to her plan arrived when the custodian waved from the door, then refused the handshake. He gave his name as Ortis Malo, 57, a retired welder who mowed the lawn and watched the boiler. He said the sanctuary was fine, then pointed at the basement with a look people wear when a dog growls under a porch. Clara asked for access, and he said the pastor wanted meetings upstairs only. She took exterior photos, careful with angles, noting water lines marked by silt and by seeds caught on mortar. A neighbor named Nella Groft, 61, carried a crate of hymnals toward a sedan and paused to watch her. Nella said the basement had stayed locked since the flood week and that no one wanted to carry anything down there. Clara liked facts more than rumors, so she asked for invoices, damage logs, and utility records. Ortis handed over a folder with photocopied bills, each page smelling like bleach even through the plastic sleeve. The electric bill showed a high spike the week after the river fell, which struck her as odd for an empty space. When she asked for the basement key, Ortis rubbed his jaw and said the lock stuck, then said the pastor handled everything personally. She kept her voice soft, mentioned schedule pressure, then offered to meet the pastor after dinner and finish this site today. He agreed, but he kept glancing at the stairwell door like it might open on its own. Clara went to the county office and checked archived calls for emergency service, using an index the clerk let her see without fuss. The church address appeared twice during the flood days, once for a fuel smell, once for a welfare check that cleared in minutes. A dispatcher note said volunteers had stacked food in the basement for short-term storage. She returned before sunset, met the pastor near the front pews, and introduced herself with her license card. Pastor Enoch Varela, 46, wore a work shirt with rolled sleeves, and his palms looked scraped at the knuckles. He repeated that the sanctuary took no damage, then said the basement had a minor issue they were addressing privately. Clara explained her process, said transparency helped claims move faster, and asked for a basic walkthrough with photos. He agreed to a limited tour, then warned her that the air down there felt close and would not be pleasant. She took out a disposable respirator she kept for mold sites, and he nodded with relief, like that solved part of it. The key turned after a stubborn rattle, and the door opened with a smell like wet paper mixed with diesel. Steps went down into dimness that felt cooler than upstairs, and the walls showed a faint brown tide mark. Her light found a row of folding tables stacked with canned goods and boxes, all tied off with twine. Several tabletops were warped, and the legs stood at different heights because someone had shimmed them with hymnals wrapped in plastic. A generator sat to one side with a coiled cord, and the floor around it showed a clean square like a rug had been there. She photographed outlets, tagged the generator model, and asked why they needed so much power for a basement pantry. The pastor said the generator ran sump pumps for 2 nights, then stopped working from grit in the line. Ortis stood near the bottom step and rubbed the rail, his knuckles pale, like he hated the room and also belonged to it. Clara noticed a water line over the breaker box, which meant the panel had taken a hit and still looked strangely spotless. A woman appeared in the doorway, waved, and introduced herself as Paloma Cray, 32, a volunteer nurse with the food team. Paloma asked if Clara needed masking tape for labels, then added that people had slept here during the flood watch. The pastor cut in with a quick no, and Paloma closed her mouth and drifted back into shadow. Clara felt the hush that follows a correction and decided to run her questions in a sequence that built without heat. She asked about occupancy during the flood, and Pastor Varela said only supplies had been staged downstairs. She asked to see any damage to pew cushions or classrooms, and he steered her back toward the stairs with a brisk thank you. In the parking lot, a teenager skated past and kicked the curb, then said people said the basement hummed after midnight. He pointed at the brickwork view vents near the ground and said sound came out like a freezer that could talk. He grinned, then looked sorry for talking, and pushed off toward the next slot without another word. Clara sat in her car and recorded a memo into her phone, keeping the tone neutral and the timestamp obvious. She reviewed photos, zoomed on the clean square by the generator, and marked a note about missing equipment. That square looked like freezer footprint, and on a raised plan like this basement, a freezer could stay mostly dry. Her next stop was a building supply yard, where she asked the clerk for recent sales of heavy appliances paid in cash. The clerk shrugged, then said a man from the church bought a chest freezer late in the flood week and paid without a receipt. That detail qualified as a witness statement, and she typed it as such, careful not to lean on it more than it deserved. Evening pushed in, and she returned for one more look while people set up for a community meal upstairs. She asked Paloma for 5 minutes in the basement to recheck the panel labels, promising to stay out of the way. Paloma agreed, then quietly handed over a small key that looked too new for an old door, her eyes level and steady. Downstairs, the lights flickered as if a loose connection lived somewhere behind the fresh panel cover. Near the far wall, she found two pallets draped with tarps that had been taped several times, and the tape pulled white in places. A faint, sweet odor rode the damp smell, like fruit left in a trunk after a warm day at the lake. She lifted a corner and found case water stacked over a long trough cut into the slab, its edges chipped and sharp. A length of garden hose ran from the trough to a sill drain where floodwater had once receded, and the hose still glistened. She followed the hose with her light, stepped around the tarps, and saw the end shoved behind a dented freezer. The cord was gone, but a film of oil on the floor traced a path toward the clean square near the generator. She crouched, counted to 5 to settle her breath, then stood and walked back toward the stairs to reset her approach. On the way up, she passed Ortis as he came down, his arms full of clean towels for reasons that felt unclear. Clara asked if they had documented any salvage from the basement that could justify the electric spike. He nodded too quickly, said there had been a spill from a donated machine, and that they had cleaned it thoroughly after. She thanked him, then stepped outside and listened to a rain gutter tick as the day cooled into night. Her hotel room was quiet, and she laid the photos on the table beside the binder she kept for flood jobs. She cross-checked the electric spike days against the generator ownership dates, using calls the county clerk let her copy. A pattern formed, modest and plain, which said power ran in the basement several nights after the river pulled back. She called a friend who worked restoration and asked about standard practice for wet freezers in basements. He said most techs would drag them outside, prop the lid, and tape a sign to keep people away until haul out. He said running a generator indoors for a freezer was dangerous, and added that diesel odor with sweet tang usually meant refrigerant leaked. Clara returned at first light and found Paloma sorting donated jackets on the front steps. Paloma watched the street, then said she had worked disaster shelters before and knew that water brings out the best and worst. She said she had asked to close the basement and that she would be happier if an outsider made decisions for them. With Paloma present, Clara requested a formal walkthrough with full photo documentation, and the pastor agreed after a long pause. He suggested they invite a town officer to keep things calm, and she agreed without hesitation since an extra witness helps. Officer Renwall, 39, arrived and signed the site log that Clara carried in her bag for exactly this moment. They opened the basement door together, and the smell rose again, edged with sourness that set teeth on edge. Wren kept a straightforward tone, said they would check for safety risks and nothing more, and the pastor nodded with his jaw set. They moved toward the far pallets, and Paloma touched Clara's elbow, then pointed with 2 fingers at the sill drain. Clara photographed the hose, the trough, and the freezer compression dents that matched a recent move across gritty floor. Wren looked at the panel and said the cover was new, then asked if an electrician had cleared it, keeping his voice even. Ortis said he would get the paperwork tomorrow, and stared at the drain like he feared what might back up through it. The twist waited in a storage closet behind a rolling chalkboard where someone had stacked plastic tubs in a neat column. Wren asked permission, lifted the lid on the top tub, and found medical waste bags tied with careful knots. The labels showed a clinic in a nearby county, and date codes matched the flood week plus 3 days after. Paloma exhaled, then said the town clinic had shut power during the worst night and that someone offered temporary cold storage here. The pastor stared at the bags and rubbed his temple, then said yes, they had tried to help and keep things under control. Ortis said the freezer had failed, they had panicked, and they had moved what they could to ice chests upstairs. Clara kept her voice in the middle as she asked whether any records accompanied the delivery of those bags. The pastor produced a photocopy from his wallet that showed a shaky agreement to secure and return the materials promptly. Wren read it twice, nodded, and said they needed to report this and arrange a proper collection, and the pastor said he understood. The pieces now fit the noise locals heard at night, the generator, and the spike in the bill after the rain. Refrigeration had kept those bags stable for a short window, then failed when the sump pumps stole too much current. The sweet tang in the air had been refrigerant, and the last trace of spoiled ice from makeshift coolers. They documented the closet, sealed the tubs again, and carried them upstairs where the air felt simple and bright. Wren radioed the county, asked for a hazmat team and the clinic contact, and kept his words plain so no one panicked. Paloma called volunteers to move the meal upstairs, and they did it quietly, like they were shifting a sleeping child. Within an hour, a small truck arrived with two techs who spoke carefully and signed every line Clara handed over. They packed the tubs into rigid containers and handed the pastor a receipt that settled chain of custody without drama. The tech said this sort of mix-up happens in storms when freezers are scarce, and that it becomes a cautionary tale for years. After the truck left, Clara took final photos of the basement and noted the cracked trough that had worried her from the start. She recommended a full inspection for the panel and air testing before volunteers returned to work downstairs. The pastor agreed, his voice steady now, and Ortis finally sat on the steps and let his shoulders drop like a load had slid off. The town never made a scandal of it, since nothing criminal had been intended, and the fix was clean and quick. That said, people still avoided the basement for a while, since memory can stick to concrete and walls like damp. They spoke of the humming nights as a warning, and they stored donations upstairs where anyone could see them in daylight. Clara filed the report that afternoon and drove out past fields that glittered with wet leaves pushed against fences. She felt no thrill, only quiet relief that the pieces had held together and that nothing worse had formed in secret. Her notes added a simple line that generosity without planning can rot faster than anyone expects in warm water. Later, she learned the church held a small meeting and told their members the whole sequence with plain language. They apologized to the clinic and offered money for the generator fuel that had been wasted in the failed plan. People appreciated honesty, but the basement kept its reputation because reputations have long legs when the air has smelled wrong. By autumn, the concrete was scrubbed, fans had run for weeks, and the panel wore a new sticker from an electrician. Still, a few congregants preferred folding tables upstairs, and no one minded because sunlight makes simple promises. When it rained again, the pastor stacked extra caution tape by the stairwell and kept the door locked without debate. Neighbors now say they avoided that basement not because of ghosts or whispers, but because they knew the facts. They remembered that freezers hum for reasons, and that a locked room with a sweet tang is a message rather than a mystery. The town chose to listen, and the story settled where most real stories live, halfway between relief and regret. Clara closed the file and moved on to other roofs and other high water marks, keeping her methods the same. She asked ordinary questions in steady sequence and waded through pauses that often carried more truth than quick words. The church needed time, the town needed air, and the basement needed light, and they all eventually got what they required. Years later, the flood was referenced as a hard season, not a nightmare, and the hill stayed a safe hill again. People mentioned the humming when they taught young volunteers how to store donations and why clear logs matter most. The pastor still kept the key, but he also kept the receipt that proved the chain unbroken, which made him sleep better. Clara would sometimes pass through on other assignments and find Paloma sorting jackets on the steps with calm hands. They would wave as if nothing remarkable had happened, which felt correct because the point was that nothing worse had arrived. The basement door stayed closed unless the work demanded it, and that quiet was the final lesson worth holding. The stories. This roadside photo changed the search in minutes. They called it a routine missing person search, and for most of that morning, it really felt like a routine search. A line of cars idled along a two-lane highway, and a handful of volunteers moved like slow clock hands through brush. Kira Duvall was 31, and she worked nights as a paramedic who could not stop reading maps. She took a personal day to help because she had patched hikers before, and she knew how fast heat turns hours cruel. Her plan for the day was simple and responsible, and it fit the tone of the briefing. She would work the southern fence line, check culverts, and log anything that looked out of place with a phone photo. The county sheriff had warned everyone about trespassing, and a deputy repeated the same rule in a firm voice. The missing man was named Owen Brackett, age 42, and he worked as a crane operator at a quarry north of town. Owen had left a garage sale with a box of tools, and a neighbor reportedly saw him turn toward the state highway. His sister filed a report after unanswered texts piled up overnight, and dispatch logs showed a welfare check on his small rental. He was not inside, and the bed was flat, and two mugs sat near a drying rack like small sentries. Kira walked that fence line with a volunteer named Bryn, who carried a bright orange notepad and a quiet focus. They talked little, and they moved in a steady pattern that felt almost like work at the station. The sun hummed through the haze, and cicadas made a loose electric sound over the ditch water. At 11, a deputy waved everyone toward the gravel pullout near the mile 11 marker sign. He wanted to regroup because the northern team had found a set of shoe prints near a culvert and needed space. Kira capped a water bottle, and Bryn checked the notepad, and they headed in with a slow trot. The meeting was short and clipped, and it held its shape like a sturdy box. The prints matched the size the sister described, and they angled toward a tree line that cut the field like a zipper. A drone team would scan the shadowed area, and everyone else would shift south by 2 miles and reset. Kira slid into her dusty sedan and checked her phone before moving, and that choice bent everything. A community page had started filling with posts, and a moderator had asked locals to send any roadside footage. One post sat near the top with a lot of comments, and the author had written a single line, "Is this him? Or am I seeing things?" The photo showed a shoulder of road near a farm stand, and a compact truck with a dented tailgate. A person stood beside it with a box in his arms, and the blur of the face did not help much. The timestamp showed yesterday at 4:12, and the location tag used a generic label. Bryn leaned in and squinted because the light was hard on the screen. Kira took a screenshot, then another, and she pinched the image until it turned blocky and awkward. The truck bed had two items that did not fit a garage sale box, and that was the first small tap on the door of her attention. One looked like a narrow metal rod wrapped in tape, and the other looked like a folded bag with a reflective stripe. The comments argued about whether it was Owen, and a few people mentioned a similar box. The moderator wrote that the photo had been sent in by a traveler passing through and that the original file was higher quality. Kira tried the contact button and sent a quick note with her name and the number on the volunteer badge. They drove south to the new grid, and the phone buzzed with a reply that carried a simple greeting. The traveler introduced himself as Linus, and he wrote that he had taken the photo for the farm stand sign. He said he was willing to share the full resolution image, and he attached it with a short, polite line. Kira opened the file, and the world shifted one notch toward clear. The folded bag was a safety triangle case, and the wrapped rod was a roadside jack handle with old tape. The truck had a sun-faded sticker for a fishing club 2 counties east, and a circle of mud on one tire suggested a recent dirt turnout. None of that made it Owen, and none of it placed him where the drone team worked hard. Then she saw the highway sign reflected in the farm stand glass, and the letters formed an odd mirror riddle. She rotated the phone and zoomed again, and the sign resolve clicked into place like a knot pulled tight. The number sequence matched a spur route that did not exist near the quarry or the culvert with the prints. Bryn watched her face and asked a question with no extra words. Kira answered in the same thin tone, and it sounded like two people trying not to scare a deer. The reflection showed spur 118, which only cut across the western ridge and met the old freight road near the radio towers. That was miles from the organized search, and it was the kind of road people use when they know it well. Kira called the staging number and asked for the sergeant who handled evidence intake at the pullout. She explained that a community submission included a reflection that might place the photo near the western ridge. The sergeant asked for the file, and she sent it, and then she sent a marked-up copy with a red circle around the reflection. Her voice felt steady but pointed, and she stayed inside the lanes of what volunteers were allowed to say. Dispatch called Linus to verify the time, and archived call notes later reportedly showed a clean match with his phone metadata. A deputy drove to the farm stand to confirm the angle, and his body cam captured the same letters when held at shoulder height. The sergeant asked the drone team to hold, and a small unit broke off toward the ridge with a calm, deliberate speed. Kira and Bryn reached the new grid and parked near a cattle gate that had a brown rope for a latch. The radio traffic shifted slowly, and it sounded like someone unfolding a map in a windless room. A second photo arrived from Linus, and it showed the farm stand chalkboard with a faint line of numbers written low. The numbers matched a delivery price list and the date, and a small logo that narrowed the stand to a single family. No private names made the air, and the unit handled it with care that felt almost like a quiet prayer. Kira received a thank you text and a note telling her to continue the assigned grid until instructed otherwise. She felt relief and restraint share one chair, and she went back to ditch water and briars and the chirr of cicadas. A call-out went to a tower contractor who reportedly kept a service log for access gates near the western ridge. He confirmed that a gate lock had been replaced 2 days earlier after being cut, and he sent a photo of the new brass shine. That photo sat next to Linus's image in the channel the sergeant used, and the pair looked like two buttons on a single coat. None of this guaranteed Owen had driven there, and the unit held the line on that sober point. Two residents near the spur told a deputy they had heard a truck with a loud belt late afternoon, and the detail matched the neighbor's note about Owen's squeal at idle. The deputy wrote that down as a witness statement, and he did not add any flourish beyond the time. A camera at a decommissioned way station still recorded to an old cloud account, and an archived clip reportedly captured the same dented tailgate. Kira thought about how people leave a breadcrumb trail even when they do not mean to leave anything. The farm stand glass, the chalkboard, the way station cloud, and the tower log drew a path that no single person owned. She worked her grid with a calm pace, and she answered Bryn's small questions with the patience of coworkers at a long shift. At 2:15, the radio clicked alive in a tone that set everyone breathing shallow for a moment. A unit had found a compact truck pulled off on a shelf road below the western ridge, and the plate matched Owen's registration. The truck sat at an angle with two wheels and scrub, and the safety triangle case was open near the bumper. A box of tools rested on the passenger seat with a folded receipt that listed sockets and a tape measure. They did not broadcast names, and they did not describe medical conditions over the air. The sergeant used a spare line to request medical support that fit a non-emergent transport. A paramedic unit rolled in from a highway turnaround, and Kira watched the dust rising from miles away like a signal made of powder. Hours later, an official note stated that Owen had been found alert and dehydrated, and that he had messaged family. The truck had a failed fuel pump and a dying belt, and he had tried to flag help before climbing for better reception. He slipped on loose gravel by the cut and decided to wait, and his phone battery gave up near sunset. He stayed close to the truck, and he drank the bottled water from the garage sale box that had sounded so ordinary. The investigation continued in the tidy way that follows relief, and it collected details that felt useful but unglamorous. The farm stand owner confirmed the timestamp on the chalkboard through a drawer receipt that matched the hour of the photo. The tower contractor saved his gate log for the file, and the Waystation clip was downloaded before the old cloud account could rotate storage. Nothing in those artifacts turned dramatic, and all of it built a single sturdy ladder that reached the shelf road. Kira went home after handing over her notes and a neatly labeled folder of images. She sat at her kitchen table and felt the quiet ring in her bones, like something that wanted a name. The day had not been lucky, and it had not been heroic, and it had not been cinematic either. It had been a long, tight weave of small, precise things that met each other at perfect corners. She texted Bryn a simple line and thanked her for the careful walking and the steadiness. Bryn replied with an emoji, then caught herself and sent plain words that matched the briefing rules. She wrote that the photo had been the hinge, and that Kira had noticed the hinge before anyone else did. Kira answered with a line that cut the praise in half and kept the useful part. A week later, a brief statement appeared on the county site and did not mention volunteers by name. It thanked a traveling witness who had shared a clear image, and it thanked locals who stayed off the ridge during the search. It emphasized the value of precise information, and it asked the same thing people always get asked when time turns cruel. Share what you see, and do not guess more than the picture allows. Kira read it during a station break and thought about the reflection in the farm stand glass. She thought about how often truth hides in edges and mirrors, and how a mile marker can sit inside a pane like a secret. She filed the day under a private label and promised herself to keep looking for letters where letters should not be. That promise felt like a job that anyone could do, and also like a job that some people never think to try. When people later asked about the moment that moved the search, the answer sounded almost too small. A traveler took a picture of a sign, and a volunteer noticed the wrong route in the reflection, and a team shifted. The story made no room for grand statements, and it did not need a raised voice or a perfect ending. It needed an image, a circle of red pixels, and a ridge road where a truck sat angled like a held breath. Owen went back to his routine, and a friend reportedly drove him to a mechanic who understood old belts. He brought a pie to the farm stand as a thank you, and he kept his name off any posts that asked for a retelling. The family put the box of tools back on a garage shelf, and the receipt curled into a corner like a tidy leaf. His sister changed his phone charger for a tougher cable, and she set an alert for check-ins that would not nag. Kira kept working nights, and she drew grids in her head while folding gauze or checking vitals and stoplights. She believed in documents, and she believed in witnesses, and she believed in plain, ordinary pictures that steal a detail. She did not frame it as fate, and she did not call it anything with a shine. She called it paying attention, and she let the phrase sit like a low, steady light behind her ribs. Some stories end with a headline, and some stories end with a sentence that barely dents the air. This one ended with a screenshot, a small glass reflection, and a map where a wrong turn finally made sense. The title that made the rounds sounded dramatic, and the truth behind it stayed comfortably simple. A roadside photo changed the search in minutes because someone looked twice and then told the right person fast. The stories. This dispatcher flagged a warning nobody else heard. In the summer of 2015, a small county dispatch center in the Midwest logged what should have been another quiet night routine calls, minor accidents, nothing serious. But at 2:36 a.m., dispatcher Lorna Keats flagged a single line in the call log with a red warning tag. The rest of the shift didn't notice. 12 hours later, a missing person report came in from the same road. Lorna was 52, a mother of three, and one of the few veteran dispatchers still working nights. She'd spent more than 20 years listening to the county breathe through static. Drunk drivers, runaway teens, distant gunshots that usually turned out to be fireworks. That night, she was scheduled to train a new hire, Evan Rhodes, a quiet 20-something fresh out of community college. He remembered her as calm, methodical someone who double-checked even the quiet calls. The call in question lasted just 19 seconds. It came from an unregistered prepaid cell phone traced to the stretch of County Route 47 between mile markers 19 and 20. The caller didn't say much, just a breathy male voice repeating, "He's still here," before the line cut. Background noise, steady hum, maybe an engine, maybe wind. Lorna replayed the audio 3 times, then filed it under possible domestic disturbance. But something made her stop the recording and reopen it. According to her later statement, she heard a faint ticking sound under the voice mechanical, uneven. Like a turn signal that never clicked off, she said. At 2:38, she added a note, "Warning possible vehicle hazard, County 47." No one responded. The patrol car assigned to that region had already been rerouted to a stranded motorist 15 miles away. The shift ended at 6, and by the next day, the flag was buried beneath dozens of other overnight notes. 2 days later, a farmer found a truck half submerged in a drainage ditch along the same stretch of road. Inside was 30-year-old Bradley Norham, a construction worker from a nearby town. Engine still idling, phone missing, seatbelt unlatched. Coroner placed the time of death around 2:40 that same morning, within minutes of Lorna's flagged call. County investigators wrote it up as a single-vehicle accident. They said Bradley likely swerved to avoid a deer, hit the embankment, and drowned before he could escape. Lorna, however, couldn't let it go. She'd handled too many wrecks to ignore the timing. The ticking sound, the phrase, "he's still here," the untraceable number, it didn't add up. A week later, she retrieved the audio from archive storage and took it home on a thumb drive. Her husband found her replaying it that evening, headphones pressed tight, not speaking for almost an hour. She said she thought she heard 2 different voices, one layered under the main one. A whisper, or maybe a radio echo, she told him. He dismissed it as interference, but Lorna wasn't satisfied. She called the phone company listed in the report, Westridge Cellular, to ask about prepaid tower logs. The representative told her the call had pinged off a repeater near Old Mill Road, 2 miles east of the crash. Problem was, that tower had been offline for maintenance between midnight and 3 a.m. She double-checked through county records. The outage was confirmed. If that was true, the call shouldn't have connected at all. When she brought this to her supervisor, he told her it wasn't her concern. "The system hiccups sometimes," he said. "Let it go." Instead, she filed a quiet memo through the internal server detailing her findings and sent a copy to a friend in the State Highway Patrol. The friend, Officer Miriam Cole, kept the note, but admitted later she didn't think much of it until months afterward. Then, in November of that year, a storm knocked out power across the same district. During the outage, technicians discovered a repeater box still running from an auxiliary generator, a model decommissioned years earlier. Inside it was a burned SIM card fused into the port. Serial number partially visible. It matched the first digits of the untraceable phone from Lorna's warning. This detail never made the official report. A small internal inquiry followed, but concluded there was no functional link between the repeater malfunction and any known incident. By that point, Lorna had already transferred to a day shift. She told coworkers she didn't want to hear the night anymore. Years later, a regional journalist researching abandoned communication systems stumbled on the archived memo. The journalist, Alan Marin, interviewed Lorna at her kitchen table in 2020. By then, she'd retired and moved to a smaller town near the river. In the recording, which he later shared for a local podcast, she said something quietly that caught his attention. "You know what gets me?" he said. "He's still here." Not, "I'm still here." Someone else was supposed to hear it. Alan followed the breadcrumb trail dispatch logs, weather reports, the crash file, and that malfunctioning repeater. He found that the generator inside had been serviced twice after its supposed decommission date, each time by a subcontractor called Northspan Utilities. Northspan had folded in 2013, 2 years before the incident. Whoever maintained that repeater after the shutdown wasn't listed in county records. Allen managed to contact one former Northspan technician, a man named Dennis Harlow. Dennis said that in the early 2000s, some repeaters were used to piggyback maintenance frequencies for nearby rail lines. It was a cheap way to test emergency signals, he said, but it was never supposed to overlap with civilian channels. If it did, you'd get bleed through, like ghost calls. Ghost calls. That term caught traction online when Allen's podcast aired, though Lorna hated it. She said the word ghost turned it into superstition, not signal bleed, not malfunction. Still, she admitted the possibility haunted her. The crash site, the voice, the timestamp, they lined up too neatly. In 2021, the county repaved Route 47, covering the drainage ditch. The wreckage was long removed, but for maintenance training, new dispatchers were still shown the red flagged log from that night as a case study in procedural diligence. The warning nobody else heard became a quiet legend among the staff, half cautionary tale, half proof of how easily small details slip away. What remained were fragments. The 19-second clip archived under a generic file name, the memo Lorna wrote, the service invoices from Northspan, and the coroner's note listing water in the lungs. Each on its own could mean nothing. Together, they formed a pattern too odd to ignore but too thin to prove. Lorna passed away in 2023. At her retirement gathering the year before, a few old colleagues brought up the story. She just smiled and said, it was probably static. Then, according to Evan, her trainee from that night, she added quietly, but static comes from somewhere. At this point, the facts that remained were simple. One call, one warning, one man dead on a dark county road. The system logged everything perfectly except for the truth behind that 19-second window. Whether it was interference, a misrouted test frequency, or something else, no one could ever show exactly who made that call or why it stopped where it did. Still, in the dispatch training manual filed a few years later, there's a footnote beside Lorna's case study. It reads, "Always listen twice before you clear a line." No capital letters, no bold text, just quiet advice embedded between procedural codes. A reminder that sometimes the sound we dismiss as noise might be the only signal that matters. The stories. This night guard filed a missing hours report. The file started as something routine, a timestamp discrepancy in a small town security log. A night guard at a regional warehouse filed a missing hours report, claiming his time card didn't match the hours he'd actually worked. The report was short, oddly calm, and dated early March of 2019. No one thought much of it until he never came back to work. His name was Leon Hartridge, 43, a former truck driver who'd switched to night security after a back injury. The warehouse sat off a rural interstate, the kind of place that smells like cold concrete and diesel even after midnight. Leon's shift started at 10 and ended at 6. His wife told investigators he usually came home by 6:30, drank coffee, watched old westerns, then slept until afternoon. That pattern broke on a Wednesday night when he didn't clock out. The initial assumption was simple. Maybe he quit. Maybe he got another job, or maybe he just walked away. But the following morning, his supervisor found his lunchbox, still sealed, and a half-empty thermos on the break room counter. His reflective vest hung neatly on a hook, radio still attached. The last digital swipe of his ID was logged at 3:42 a.m., then nothing. The company filed a basic absence form, but by Friday, the sheriff's office got involved. They reviewed the overnight CCTV, 6 cameras in total. 5 worked fine. The 6th, covering the north loading dock, froze at exactly 3:41 a.m. Then, 3 minutes later, all motion detection stopped. It wasn't just a blackout, The file header showed it had been manually overwritten. Leon's brother, a retired electrician, offered to check his apartment when calls went unanswered. Inside, he found Leon's keys on the counter, wallet in the same place he always left it, and a spiral notebook on the kitchen table. The last entry, written in his blocky handwriting, read, "Clock shows 4 when I walk out. Feels later. Light's wrong color again." Investigators traced that note back to similar remarks he'd made to coworkers in the weeks before. One of them, a forklift operator named Ray Corbin, told deputies Leon had been bothered by something about the new lighting system. The company had replaced the overhead fluorescents with motion-activated LEDs that flickered under certain camera angles. He said it messed with his sense of time, Ray recalled. He'd come in thinking it was midnight and swear it was almost morning. At first, police treated the notebook as irrelevant, a tired man rambling about lights. Then came the dispatch logs. A 3:48 a.m. call had been placed from Leon's company-issued phone to a non-emergency county line. The recording still exists. He told the operator he needed to document something about the schedule. His tone was formal, detached, like he was making a statement rather than asking for help. The operator tried to clarify what he meant, but the line dropped mid-sentence. The call lasted 53 seconds. When they checked the network records, they found something else. The call didn't route through the cell tower nearest the warehouse. It bounced from a tower 30 miles east across the river. That's the same direction Leon's phone was last pinged before it went offline, near an unfinished section of the old state bypass, closed since 2011. Deputies drove out there and found fresh tire tracks in the gravel, leading toward a fenced construction lot. No vehicle was recovered. Weeks passed. Local news ran a single story: warehouse guard missing after time card dispute. Public interest faded quickly. And as fashion, local news wanted the power. But in June, the company's new HR contractor discovered something odd while auditing payroll. Leon's time card for that final night didn't just show missing hours, it showed duplicated entries. Between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m., his ID was logged twice at 2 different doors, seconds apart. One swipe at the front entrance, one in the mechanical hallway. Same ID, same timestamp. Technically impossible. Investigators re-examined the internal server that housed the door logs. That's when they noticed a secondary access profile had been created using Leon's credentials, but tagged with a different department code, one belonging to the electrical maintenance division. The account was active for 1 week, then deleted. IT records listed the administrator as temporary systems testing. No one at the warehouse remembered authorizing it. The more they dug, the stranger the timeline became. Archived footage from prior nights showed brief blips in the digital clock, displays 3-second shifts where the time rolled backward before correcting itself. Leon had written about this in another note. Clock skipped again. Same moment the hum cut out. Technicians later confirmed that during those same minutes, a backup generator was cycling power for a series of sublevel fans. Only a few workers even knew the sublevels existed. They weren't active parts of the facility anymore. When authorities finally inspected the lower level, they found old offices sealed off with plastic sheeting and warning signs for asbestos. In one corner sat an unplugged time clock terminal dated 1994. The paper spool inside it still contained partial punch cards, yellowed and brittle. One of them bore Leon's employee number, printed faintly beside the name of a former contractor who died years earlier. That discovery reframed everything. Somehow, the modern ID system had merged data with the obsolete one, producing overlapping records that made it appear Leon was in 2 places at once. The missing hours report he'd filed wasn't about unpaid wages, it was about time itself, slipping in a way he couldn't explain. The investigators never found conclusive proof of tampering, though one retired systems tech told local reporters that the company's old mainframe still ran partial code from a discontinued scheduling program called ShiftLine. He claimed that under rare conditions, like a power cycle during data backup, it could duplicate entries with original punch data from the archive, labeling them with active credentials. If that happened when Leon's ID was scanned, it might have triggered a fatal error, but that's still theory. What's factual is this. The same Friday, the audit uncovered the duplicate entries. A highway cleanup crew reported finding a fragment of a reflective safety vest along the bypass construction route. It matched the brand issued to Leon's team. DNA analysis was inconclusive exposure, and time had degraded it, but one detail stood out. The vest's zipper pull contained traces of oil consistent with the warehouse's loading dock equipment. In the end, the case file closed under missing person, presumed deceased. Officially, no foul play. Unofficially, everyone agreed something in that building broke his sense of time before he vanished. His wife still keeps the notebook on a shelf. The last page, just beneath his final note, has a short line written in different ink, maybe added later, maybe the same night. It reads, "Clock shows 4, door says 3. At this point, the facts that remained were simple. A man noticed an inconsistency, tried to document it, and disappeared between two readings of the same minute. Whether that was error, accident, or something stranger about how those systems looped, no one can say for certain. The warehouse eventually upgraded its entire security network, scrapping every trace of the old servers. But the missing hours report still sits in the county archive, a single-page statement with the timestamp frozen at 3:42 a.m., the same moment the camera went dark. The stories. The silent hospital wing with alleged final footage. The north wing stayed quiet after visiting hours, and the only noise came from vents that clicked like tired metronomes. Staff shared the same phrase for years, reportedly calling it the silent hallway where the lights hummed slightly brighter. Mara Kincaid was 34, and she worked nights as a charge nurse who still wrote notes by hand. She liked predictable rounds, and she liked checking the machines herself because she trusted beeps less than faces. On a rainy Thursday, her simple goal was to finish a wound check, sign a stack of orders, and clock out. The shift began with a late dinner in the break room, and it seemed like the kind of night nothing remembers. Ronan Vale was 36, and he supervised maintenance with a patience that came from old factory work. He carried a pocket radio with a broken antenna, and he logged every outlet test like it mattered to someone. The incident started when a patient in the north wing pressed his call button, then silence followed without any voice reply. The archived call log showed the button was held for 5 seconds, then released, then tapped again 3 times. Mara reached the door first, and she cleared her throat before pushing with her shoulder, since the latch stuck on humid nights. The room was empty, and the bed rails were up, and the bathroom light was on without any water running. She checked the hallway camera by the nurse's station, and the feed had frozen on a frame where no one stood. Ronan arrived with a service cart, and he frowned, and he asked if anyone had patched the camera since last quarter. "Patient transfer, maybe," Mara said, and she kept her voice low because the corridor carried everything. "I never got a page about a transport." Ronan pulled the maintenance binder, and he pointed at an entry from 2019 that mentioned a power fluctuation. "Different camera," he said, and his thumb tapped the page like a small hammer, finishing an obvious nail. They checked the bed chart, and the name line only held initials, because the unit had privacy rules for sensitive admissions. The time of admission was listed as 2200, and the diagnosis read observation, and nothing else was printed. A housekeeper named Iola Reyes rolled a linen hamper by them, and she said the patient asked earlier about the stairwell. Witness statements later noted she had not seen a badge on the patient wrist, and she remembered the smell of antiseptic. Mara searched the bathroom, and she counted 5 cotton swabs in the trash, along with 2 adhesive tabs that had curled. She took a photo with the hospital phone, and the flash startled her because she had forgotten to disable the shutter sound. Ronan opened the ceiling tile by the door, and he peered at the cable run that fed the camera and the smoke sensor. He found a hairline crack in the conduit, and a tiny curl of metal shaving rested on the tile like a silver thread. They followed policy, and they called security, and a guard named Derry Boone wrote the time on his palm with a marker. His radio squawked, and dispatch logs later captured the clipped exchange that said North Wing camera frozen since 2215. The investigation moved across small squares of evidence, and every piece felt ordinary until each piece started fitting. Mara pulled prior vitals from the network, and the last reading on that room was normal. Then the device stopped sending updates. Ronan replayed earlier camera clips from other angles, and he found 5 seconds where the emergency exit alert blinked. Witness statements reported no alarm sounded on the floor, which suggested a silenced switch or a failed buzzer behind the plate. They visited the stairwell, and it smelled like wet concrete, and there were footprints that pulled dirt up in little arches. The toe pattern looked like patient socks, and a scuff line dragged for a foot, then stopped, and then resumed. Iola walked the corridor with them, and she rested her hands on the hamper edges like it was a steering wheel. He asked if the vending machine ever takes bills this late, she said, and her tone was apologetic without a reason. Mara checked the cafeteria camera archive, and she searched timestamps between 2200 and 2230 without breaks. The footage showed vending lights flicker and a rolling reflection of the ice machine door, and no patient approached either. Ronan called the on-call electrician, and he asked for a line test on the north wing circuits beyond the junction. The electrician reportedly answered from a truck outside, and he said storms cause weird ghosts when the backup inverter handshakes incorrectly. Security reviewed vehicle gates, and the record showed no exits, and it showed one ambulance arrival and one taxi inbound turn. The taxi camera caught rain on the lens, and the shapes in the frame appeared like shadows pretending to be people moving. Mara walked back to the room, and she sat in the visitor chair, and she looked at the bed like a stage. The sheets held a diagonal crease that suggested someone sat on the edge, then changed their mind, and stood slowly. She noticed a folded paper beneath the pillow, and it was hospital stationery, and the writing was cramped and slanted. The note read, "They said I would sleep here for observation. I only asked for quiet. I will make it quiet myself." She showed Ronan, and he raised his eyebrows, and he said people write strange lines when they want control again. "Could be a statement," he said, and he took a photo, and he set the paper back where it had been resting. They checked the elevator camera on the service lift, and they saw no one, and they saw the doors hesitate twice without reason. The maintenance panel log showed a fault code that matched a sticky optical sensor, which could create a false occupancy reading. Security walked the roof, and raindrops traveled in sheets, and the helicopter pad lights buzzed, and the wind pulled at the harness. No prints held on the rubber mat under that weather, and the team recorded nothing except water pooling near a drain. Mara called the number listed for the initials on the chart, and the voicemail answered with a generic greeting without a name. The archived calls showed she left a message, and she marked the record for a social worker referral the next morning. The twist arrived from a workstation that handled the wing wide overnight monitor board, which recorded short clips for training. Ronan found a separate storage folder, and he found files with timestamps that matched the frozen camera, which suggested a mirrored buffer. He played the file, and the first seconds held the empty corridor, and the lights hummed, and the vents clicked rhythmically. Then a figure stepped into frame from the bathroom, and the face stayed bowed, and the person held a small device. The figure pressed the call button and waited, and pressed again, and then looked directly into the lens with a steady expression. The person wore a blue patient gown, and there was no bracelet, and a square of bandage covered the left forearm. The figure spoke one line, and the audio kept popping, and the words were difficult but not impossible, and they landed heavily. The line sounded like, "Please log this as a discharge without paper. I will return the quiet that was promised tonight." The figure leaned toward the hallway exit, and held up a magnet key that looked improvised from a maintenance badge shell. Ronan froze the frame, and he zoomed carefully, and he compared the lanyard clip to older staff models from storage. He opened a drawer on his cart, and he pulled a shadowed badge, and the clip matched the same notched jaw. He remembered a report from 2011 that mentioned missing spares, and he realized the old inventory never reconciled fully. Mara watched the clip again, and she noticed the brief stop at the door where the hand paused near the hinge. The person shifted weight, and the gown hem lifted, and a glimpse of ankle revealed a piece of linen tied like cord. They searched the linen cart and found a torn sheet corner and a tight knot that matched the quick tie and frame. Witness statements sometimes miss small habits, and this one felt like proof that the same hands moved through every part. Security traced the stairwell door with a flashlight, and the latch plate held a line of smudged residue near the tongue. The residue smelled faintly of hand sanitizer, and the drizzle likely washed everything else, and a small rectangle mark remained. Ronan printed the frame, and he marked the hallway clock on the wall, and then drew a diagonal line. If the figure left at that angle, he reasoned, then the person would pass the decommissioned lab and the loading dock walkway. They opened the door to the old lab, and stale air settled on their shoulders, and a single emergency light hummed. A small stool sat under the wall phone, and the receiver was off, and the dispatch recorded 2 seconds of static. The loading dock camera had the clearest view, and the rain helped by shining every surface like a clean mirror. The figure emerged under the overhang and paused and placed the improvised badge on the scale and stared at the red numbers. Mara said quietly that people sometimes need clocks that have nothing to do with time, and Ronan nodded without looking away. The figure moved toward the far gate, and the frame caught a truck pulling in, and the headlamps blinded the sensor briefly. The alleged final footage ended with the figure stepping beyond the painted yellow line, and the clip cut to black. The storage folder wrote a partial next file, and the timestamp advanced 1 minute, and the next image showed only rain and darkness. Security canvassed the area beyond the gate the next morning, and they found a blue paper cap in a pothole. A supermarket clerk down the road later told them privately that a person in a gown bought a jacket before sunrise. The clerk described a steady voice and a careful posture, and a request for the cheapest jacket that still had a zipper. She remembered a folded square of tape on the person's wrist, and she said the person counted bills with deliberate focus. Mara filed the incident summary, and she kept the note line without interpretation because her job was to record and proceed. She added the sentence about the linen tie, and she added the part about the magnet key, and she kept the tone steady. Ronan wrote a maintenance report that asked for a complete audit of old badge hardware and an updated inventory process. He requested a camera firmware refresh schedule, and he recommended replacing the corridor conduit that carried the vulnerable signal run. The hospital quietly changed the North Wing protocol, and now every quiet room kept a visitor log under a laminated sheet. Nurses checked the stairwell latch every round, and security scanned badge shells weekly, and housekeeping marked any torn linens. Months later, a social worker forwarded a letter to administration, and it mentioned a patient who left without signing. The message said the person had revisited, reportedly during a volunteer day, and returned the improvised badge in a sealed envelope. The letter closed with a single sentence that matched the tone of that night and felt like a bookend that fit. The person wrote, "Please remove my initials from the board. My observation ended when your hallway stopped pretending to be quiet." Mara read that line twice in silence, and she folded the paper and she placed it in the confidential binder. She stood outside the north wing and she listened to the vents, and she heard the hum as part of routine. Ronan installed the new camera, and he tightened the bracket, and he watched the live feed while the corridor waited. The picture captured only light and doors and floor, and that was the point, and he signed the work order neatly. Staff still tell the story in pieces, and they keep the facts close and the phrasing softer than rumors deserve. Most say the footage is final because it ends, and because endings feel like decisions, even when the person continues somewhere else. The hospital kept the clip off the training servers, and only a few supervisors can access the mirrored buffer folder. They treat it with the same caution they give to old X-rays, and they open it only when policies turn uncertain. When the night quiets, the north wing sounds the same as any other hallway, with that hum that never quits. People who know the incident say quiet is never silence, and they say promises can be kept without anyone hearing the words. If the figure returns again, security will log the time, and maintenance will test the lines, and nursing will keep notes. The story already taught them that quiet can hide intentions, and that evidence can walk on socked feet and still register. Mara keeps working nights, and she still checks machines in person, and she still trusts faces more than recorded beeps. Ronan keeps his pocket radio, and he keeps sharpening his pencil with a knife, and he keeps circling dates on forms. They do not trade theories in the break room, because theories cannot start IVs, and they cannot prevent skipped alarms. They keep procedures updated, and they keep the story within policy, and they let the hallway be simply a hallway again. When someone new asks about the silent north wing, staff shrug with a practiced economy that looks almost like kindness. They know quiet can be a boundary people choose, and they know cameras capture frames, and they know choices finish off screen. The hallway holds steady under the lights, and the vents click, and the doors breathe slightly as pressure shifts slowly. Whatever happened that night belongs to lines and logs and to a voice recorded over rain, asking for uncomplicated quiet. In the end, the building remembers through everyday details and people remember through work, and that is usually enough. The north wing remains quiet, not empty, and the lesson sits on a shelf with a label that only insiders recognize. The stories. This dispatcher flagged a warning nobody else heard. In the summer of 2015, a small county dispatch center in the Midwest logged what should have been another quiet night routine calls, minor accidents, nothing serious. But at 2:36 a.m., dispatcher Lorna Keats flagged a single line in the call log with a red warning tag. The rest of the shift didn't notice. 12 hours later, a missing person report came in from the same road. Lorna was 52, a mother of three, and one of the few veteran dispatchers still working nights. She'd spent more than 20 years listening to the county breathe through static. Drunk drivers, runaway teens, distant gunshots that usually turned out to be fireworks. That night, she was scheduled to train a new hire, Evan Rhodes, a quiet 20-something fresh out of community college. He remembered her as calm, methodical someone who double-checked even the quiet calls. The call in question lasted just 19 seconds. It came from an unregistered prepaid cell phone traced to the stretch of County Route 47 between mile markers 19 and 20. The caller didn't say much, just a breathy male voice repeating, "He's still here," before the line cut. Background noise, steady hum, maybe an engine, maybe wind. Lorna replayed the audio 3 times, then filed it under possible domestic disturbance. But something made her stop the recording and reopen it. According to her later statement, she heard a faint ticking sound under the voice mechanical, uneven. Like a turn signal that never clicked off, she said. At 2:38, she added a note, "Warning possible vehicle hazard, County 47." No one responded. The patrol car assigned to that region had already been rerouted to a stranded motorist 15 miles away. The shift ended at 6, and by the next day, the flag was buried beneath dozens of other overnight notes. 2 days later, a farmer found a truck half submerged in a drainage ditch along the same stretch of road. Inside was 30-year-old Bradley Norum, a construction worker from a nearby town. Engine still idling, phone missing, seatbelt unlatched. Coroner placed the time of death around 2:40 that same morning, within minutes of Lorna's flagged call. County investigators wrote it up as a single vehicle accident. They said Bradley likely swerved to avoid a deer, hit the embankment, and drowned before he could escape. Lorna, however, couldn't let it go. She'd handled too many wrecks to ignore the timing. The ticking sound, the phrase, "he's still here," the untraceable number, it didn't add up. A week later, she retrieved the audio from archive storage and took it home on a thumb drive. Her husband found her replaying it that evening, headphones pressed tight, not speaking for almost an hour. She said she thought she heard two different voices, one layered under the main one. A whisper, or maybe a radio echo, she told him. He dismissed it as interference, but Lorna wasn't satisfied. She called the phone company listed in the report, Westridge Cellular, to ask about prepaid tower logs. The representative told her the call had pinged off a repeater near Old Mill Road, 2 miles east of the crash. Problem was, that tower had been offline for maintenance between midnight and 3 a.m. She double-checked through county records. The outage was confirmed. If that was true, the call shouldn't have connected at all. When she brought this to her supervisor, he told her it wasn't her concern. The system hiccups sometimes, he said. Let it go. Instead, she filed a quiet memo through the internal server detailing her findings and sent a copy to a friend in the State Highway Patrol. The friend, Officer Miriam Cole, kept the note, but admitted later she didn't think much of it until months afterward. Then, in November of that year, a storm knocked out power across the same district. During the outage, technicians discovered a repeater box still running from an auxiliary generator, a model decommissioned years earlier. Inside it was a burned SIM card fused into the port. Serial number partially visible. It matched the first digits of the untraceable phone from Lorna's warning. This detail never made the official report. A small internal inquiry followed, but concluded there was no functional link between the repeater malfunction and any known incident. By that point, Lorna had already transferred to a day shift. She told coworkers she didn't want to hear the night anymore. Years later, a regional journalist researching abandoned communication systems stumbled on the archived memo. The journalist, Alan Marin, interviewed Lorna at her kitchen table in 2020. By then, she'd retired and moved to a smaller town near the river. In the recording, which he later shared for a local podcast, she said something quietly that caught his attention. "You know what gets me?" he said. "He's still here." Not, "I'm still here." Someone else was supposed to hear it. Alan followed the breadcrumb trail dispatch logs, weather reports, the crash file, and that malfunctioning repeater. He found that the generator inside had been serviced twice after its supposed decommission date, each time by a subcontractor called Northspan Utilities. Northspan had folded in 2013, 2 years before the incident. Whoever maintained that repeater after the shutdown wasn't listed in county records. Allen managed to contact one former Northspan technician, a man named Dennis Harlow. Dennis said that in the early 2000s, some repeaters were used to piggyback maintenance frequencies for nearby rail lines. It was a cheap way to test emergency signals, he said. But it was never supposed to overlap with civilian channels. If it did, you'd get bleed-through, like ghost calls. Ghost calls. That term caught traction online when Alan's podcast aired, though Lorna hated it. She said the word ghost turned it into superstition, not signal bleed, not malfunction. Still, she admitted the possibility haunted her. The crash site, the voice, the timestamp, they lined up too neatly. In 2021, the county repaved Route 47, covering the drainage ditch. The wreckage was long removed, but for maintenance training, new dispatchers were still shown the red-flagged log from that night as a case study in procedural diligence. The warning nobody else heard became a quiet legend among the staff, half cautionary tale, half proof of how easily small details slip away. What remained were fragments. The 19-second clip archived under a generic file name, the memo Lorna wrote, the service invoices from Northspan, and the coroner's note listing water in the lungs. Each on its own could mean nothing. Together, they formed a pattern too odd to ignore but too thin to prove. Lorna passed away in 2023. At her retirement gathering the year before, a few old colleagues brought up the story. She just smiled and said, it was probably static. Then, according to Evan, her trainee from that night, she added quietly, but static comes from somewhere. At this point, the facts that remained were simple. One call, one warning, one man dead on a dark county road. The system logged everything perfectly except for the truth behind that 19-second window. Whether it was interference, a misrouted test frequency, or something else, no one could ever show exactly who made that call or why it stopped where it did. Still, in the dispatch training manual filed a few years later, there's a footnote beside Lorna's case study. It reads, "Always listen twice before you clear a line." No capital letters, no bold text, just quiet advice embedded between procedural codes. A reminder that sometimes the sound we dismiss as noise might be the only signal that matters. The bridge collapse files of Red River County. Locals in Clarksville still point toward the slow bend of the Red River and mention a span that failed without warning. They talk about a sound like lumber snapping across a barnyard and a brown cloud that rolled off the water. Some say the river went quiet for a full minute. Others insist the current rushed harder against the pilings. The event sits between printed pages and tired memories, where dates blur and names drift across coffee counters. Investigators never confirmed a single narrative, and the surviving paperwork reads like a map with two north arrows. The first name that appears across the county file from 2009 is Thomas Avery, 52, consulting civil engineer, in town to review seasonal scour near the east abutment. He arrived from Texarkana on a rented pickup, carried a folding stadia rod, and booked a room at a roadside motor court. His notes, reportedly scanned and misplaced twice, show pencil sketches with neat arrows along gravel approaches. He wrote that spring runoff had undercut a clay shelf and that riprap placement lagged a full year. He planned a second pass at lower water with a contractor present and a county foreman on site. Dispatch logs from the same period reference Maria Kent, 41, paramedic with Red River EMS, sent toward the span after a motorist report about drifting planks. Her unit rolled north on farm-to-market roads with steady radio checks and a quiet engine whine. The log timestamps conflict with her own written addendum, which places her arrival 8 minutes before the first deputy. She noted empty guardrails and a harder breeze from the west that pushed dust into the shallows. She stayed at the south approach and waited for a crew to secure a lane with cones and a chain. A third figure threads through state records and later summaries: Caleb Ross, 29, county road crew foreman, scheduled to meet Avery for a survey walk. He reportedly left the yard early with a steel tape, a faded vest, and a thermos dented along one side. The daybook from his shop lists a fuel top-off at 6, a load of rock at 7, and a plan to check the far pier before lunch. Some locals claimed Ross stopped at a grocery for ice and never returned to the truck. Others stated he reached the bridge and waved toward the river. The record of his exact route remains unsettled, and the receipt pile is thinner than expected. Archive notes say the span was a modest truss with timber decking and 3 concrete piers set in an easy channel. The far bank rose into cottonwoods, and the near bank held a graded turnout where anglers backed trailers down a slab. Maintenance logs speak of patched planks and a cracked bearing plate that had been shimmed on a wet afternoon. The repair order shows a red pencil remark that reads, "Still serviceable under single lane only." No one signed a final clearance, and the renewal request died in a stack under a broken stapler. When the structure failed, the sequence becomes a field of magnets pulling in different directions that never quite align. One witness claimed the center deck dropped first and sent a chalky burst downstream. Another insisted the south approach slumped after a truck braked near the crown. A rancher reported hearing two distinct impacts with river echoes that sounded like a hallway door. A retired teacher described one long groan as if the river dragged a wet rope across iron. The statements share details but resist consensus, and each page announces certainty with careful handwriting. Avery's pocket notebook surfaced in a banker's box long after the final insurance letter closed. The pages record a sounding taken with a weighted line that read 14 near the mid-channel and 9 closer to the leaning pier. He wrote that drift loads had increased after a storm in early spring and that the upstream pile showed fresh scars. There is a sketch of a void under the clay lip where minnows flick through pale water. He underlined a sentence about scour mitigation with quarry stone and a call to confirm availability within 2 weeks. Kent filed her final report with a tone that suggests fixed habits and a tired office chair. She lists scene hazards that include rebar ends, loose decking, and silt clouds that limit visibility under the truss. She notes a single pickup at the turnout with no occupants and an open toolbox on the tailgate. She records a radio check to County Fire and a request for mutual aid from a neighboring district. Her remarks end with a line about river traffic and 2 anglers who declined to provide names due to a pending tournament. Ross appears next in a terse memo that cites secondhand remarks and a phone call that reached voicemail twice. The memo claims he had walked the South Bank with Avery a week earlier and marked 3 soft pockets with orange paint. It suggests he planned to return with fabric and stone once the river fell below the chalk line on the pier. The last certain fact is a signed receipt for gloves and a set of safety glasses at a hardware counter near the square. Every later detail arrives from someone who heard something in a cafe and tucked it between lunch notes. State records list 2 inspections spread across 5 years, with photographs that show a lean toward the east and a hairline crack along a bearing seat. The earlier inspection recommended a load posting that never appeared on either approach. The later inspection assigned a priority that competed with 3 other spans and a culvert collapse on a farm road. A funding note mentions a grant request that stalled after a change in office staff. The document trail grows faint as winter budgets pressed into spring potholes. Mechanical analysis came from a district engineer who used calm sentences and short clauses built for public meetings. He identifies repeated wetting and drying cycles along the timber deck that forced nails to creep. He points toward undermined clay and a narrowed channel that bent current lines against the mid-pier. He writes that a failure origin cannot be fixed with absolute precision due to scoured evidence and missing deck pieces. He asks for a dewatering plan and a crane that never materialized. The county file from 2009 includes photographs with date stamps that do not match the captions typed below. One frame shows a sagging guardrail with rust blooms and a waterline printed like a belt across concrete. Another shows tire marks that end at a splintered edge and a hat resting on a plank. A third shows an empty river surface patterned by wind from the west and a line of bubbles near the far pier. The chain of custody sheet lists a deputy who transferred out and a clerk who retired without an exit interview. Reporters drew maps on legal pads and drove the approaches with a cautious speed of someone reading old pavement for hints. Their articles stitched interviews with shop owners and 2 fishermen who claimed the river changed color after the first impact. One piece quoted a former inspector who said budget cycles have their own weather and you dress for whatever arrives. Another quoted a county commissioner who insisted the span stood within normal service metrics. The printed narratives offered resolve while the river ignored the words and moved on. Avery left town within a week, recorded by a receipt for fuel and a breakfast ticket punched with a dull hole. He returned once in late summer to present a slide deck with cross sections and equation lines that bored the room. He recommended stone placement and new bearings cut for the southern seat. He suggested a temporary Bailey to restore a single lane with strict limits. The minutes reflect nods without motion and a closing remark about waiting for cooler weather. Kent rotated off the ambulance for a quarter and took dispatch shifts under bright fluorescent light that flattened the hours. She handled calls about livestock on roads and a boy with a broken wrist and an older man short of breath. When the bridge comes up, her voice stays neutral while her hands move over paper with careful steadiness. She writes that the river remains a hazard zone and that signage needs nightly checks. She never claims more than the logs can support, and her addenda end with standard phrasing. Ross's path fades, where the road leaves town and crosses open fields toward the old ferry traces. Some locals claimed he was seen near the cottonwoods with a level rod, others placed him at a diner booth that never matched the receipt times. A cousin remembered a story about hauling stone past sunset while the radio caught distant stations. A former coworker insisted Ross called about fabric rolls and left a voicemail that never saved. The file keeps his name, but not his last location, and the river keeps its distance from closure. By winter, the approaches were fenced with mesh, and the signs leaned under north wind that smelled like iron. A temporary span sat in the planning folder and moved between committees like a slow truck. The budget hearings pressed on with pipe repairs and a school roof that leaked onto maps. The river dropped into pale seams across sandbars, and the water showed twisted metal like ribs. People drove around the detour and learned new turns that soon felt old. In spring, a work crew staged rock on the south bank and built a ramp with compacted fill and a simple slope. They moved stone against the lean of the current and watched the water change sound as voids filled. They left gaps where the divers wanted clear space and marked a lane with tall posts. A man with a clipboard checked quantities while a crane idled near the turnout. Nothing in the record names him, and no photograph shows his face. Years later, the road pulls straight toward a replacement span that rides higher over a more disciplined channel. The guardrails shine against early sun, and the deck hums under light traffic that stays within the posted signs. Downstream, the old pilings sit in shallow water like molars under a tired gum line. People fish near the shade and glance toward the bank where the gravel turnout still holds a hard edge. The current moves past their boots and says nothing that a recorder can keep. The file ends without a conclusive sentence, and the county clerk wrote, "Closed for now," along the final margin. The failure sits among numbers and measured lines and voices that hold equal conviction. The river holds its own private archive and never shares the index with the courthouse. The names remain in lists that wait for some future reader to try another alignment. Paper can repeat a story, yet the sound that began the story does not return. The stories. This highway turnout kept a secret roadside ledger. The turnout sat 3 miles past the hill crest, where the shoulder widened and an old guardrail curled around scrub pines. It looked like any layover patch on a western freight route, wind scoured and sun bleached, the kind of place drivers used when the low gear cooked too hot. Ivo Calderon was 34 and worked highway maintenance out of a county yard near a small valley town. He had the steady patience of someone who counted reflectors at dawn, and he kept a pocket notebook for bolts that liked to work loose. He planned a simple loop that Tuesday: swap a cracked mile marker, replace a dented sign, check the culvert at the turnout. He pulled the county pickup beside the rail and killed the engine, and the quiet after the fan belt felt too clean. He had heard drivers call the turnout a good place to let brakes breathe, and earlier dispatch chatter mentioned a stalled sedan reported before sunrise. The sedan was gone now, but a dark rectangle pressed into gravel showed where tires had slept. He walked the rail, tapped bolts with a wrench, and found a new scar where the metal had curled inward like a knuckle. He crouched to look for glass or plastic, and his fingers met tin. The box felt cold despite the heat, wedged under the rail post with two flat rocks bracing it tight. He checked for snakes first, then slid it out with a sand scuff. Inside was a ledger wrapped in a cut trash bag, bound with string, edges rubbed thin as old denim. On the first page, someone had printed Mile 37 turnout, keep it dry, return it where you found it. The handwriting was neat, each line pressed with a heavy hand that understood trucks and weather. The early entries read like a log of small trades, which made sense in that place and on that road. Diesel siphoned and replaced with cash, jump starts marked with initials, spare brake light bulbs counted like borrowed pencils. The dates were written carefully as words, like 2019 and 2020, and then the numbers stopped for a while when the world went strange. He flipped to a recent page and noticed a different style, lighter ink and quicker strokes that curled on the downstroke. It said, "Skimmer crew parked by mile 32 according to a driver. Call the county before you accept a tow." Another said, "Gray sedan with a trailer ball gave bottles and left at dawn. Check camera near the crest for plate." He looked at the tin again and found a folded slip beneath the ledger that smelled like lemon cleaner. Someone had written, "If you find this and you work the road, please look at dispatch logs from last winter." He recognized the phrasing and the gentle push, not a demand, more like a tired neighbor asking you to look through a fence. He set the ledger back in the tin, snapped a quick photo for memory, and secured the box the way he had found it. The air felt still, and a low thunder came from the downshift of a distant semi that needed the long lane more than talk. He got in the truck, scratched a date in his pocket notebook, and drove back toward the yard with the uneasy feeling of stepping on a path with fresh footprints. In the office after lunch, he pulled archived calls on the shared computer, which the crew used for storm maps and shift swap. The log from late winter listed a cluster of calls around mile 30, with drivers reporting a two-truck team that arrived fast and unasked. One entry used the word predatory, which was rare in casual notes, and another mentioned cash prices on a scrap of paper. He kept reading and saw a note from a county deputy about skimmers on card readers at a nearby fuel plaza. That plaza sat between the crest and the river bridge, where drivers liked to grab coffee and plug in sleepers to keep a steady chill. He printed the page, then printed the call clusters, and wrote the turnout mile in the margins because he trusted his own ink. The next morning, he returned to the route early, with a thermos and a camera that clipped to the dash like a square eye. He planned to change a reflector near the crest and let the camera watch the turnout. Nothing secret, just habit dressed as curiosity. The road held a thin fog that looked like breath on glass, and the pines below the rail felt damp enough to keep a secret. He parked, waited a few minutes, and watched a box truck pull in slow with brakes sighing like someone settling into a couch. A woman climbed out, mid-40s, hair tied back, shoulders set like someone who carried more than straps and ratchets. She checked her wheels, knocked her lugs with a bar, then walked to the guardrail with a mason jar wrapped in a towel. She crouched where the tin lived, did not look around, and worked like a person who practiced in silence and noticed the small things. She took the ledger out, slid in the folded towel, wrote 3 lines, then added a smaller page clipped by a binder clip that made a sharp click. He felt guilty watching and looked down to pretend his coffee needed attention, which it did not, but pretend worked anyway. He waited until she left, then pretended to check the culvert again, this time with a small shovel that made the roll feel official. He eased the tin out, opened the ledger to the fresh page, and read a tidy note that felt like a breadcrumb. It said, "Tow crew again, near mile 32 last night. Reportedly told a young driver they worked with the county." Another line said, "I am leaving 4 bottles of coolant and a bag of rags for anyone stuck with a pinhole." He wrote a line himself, kept to the ledger tone, and made sure the ink did not bleed through on the thin paper. He wrote, "County maintenance checked the turnout, no affiliation with tow crews, call dispatch if pressured." He tucked his page under the binder clip and slid everything back, angling the rocks to wedge firm because small rituals matter when the wind gets ideas. He drove to the fuel plaza later that morning, the one near the bridge where the skimmers had allegedly lived, and asked around. The cashier, a young guy with a careful haircut, said a retired radio operator sometimes handed out paper maps to drivers who looked lost. Reportedly, he kept notes on who needed help and who pushed scams, and he liked the old ways more than the new screens. The cashier said, "You want Arlene, not me," and pointed at the small sandwich counter where a woman was sorting bread with clean hands. Arlene had the posture of someone who had stood for decades without complaint, and her eyes moved fast, like she listened with more than ears. She listened to Evo explain his job and his curiosity, then nodded once, like a shop teacher hearing a decent plan. She said, "There is a book, but we do not write full names because we do not want fights here." She said, "Some truckers leave notes about who helped, and sometimes they warn about boys who show up too fast with chains." She added, "A retired dispatcher named Theo started it after 2014 when the corner got tricky, and people forgot how to flag without yelling. Ivo asked if anyone had brought up mile 32 in the last month, and she looked past him like she was reading a chalkboard on a far wall. She said, a kid in a small coupe said 2 trucks boxed him at night and tried to sell a winch like a miracle. She said the kid left when another driver pulled behind him with hazards blinking, which often makes a different kind of math happen. He thanked her and bought a sandwich he had not planned to buy, then sat in his truck and wrote lines in his pocket notebook. He marked the phrases retired dispatcher, ledger, tow scam, and noted that older hands tend to leave cleaner trails than noisy crews. He waited for his coffee to cool, then called the deputy listed on the winter logs and left a message saying he was checking a few things near the crest. The deputy called back that afternoon, voice calm, words clipped like someone who learned to talk over traffic noise. The deputy said there had been several reports of quick tow teams and a few complaints about skimmers, but nothing firm enough for a charge. He added that a neighbor near the climb heard engines idling around midnight often, and his dog growled the way dogs do when a rhythm is wrong. Ivo returned to the turnout at dusk with a reflective vest and a flashlight because nothing good happens when you pretend the dark is friendly. He checked the tin and found another page, this one printed with careful block letters like a patient teacher. It said, "If you need to know, check the gate camera on the service road above the crest and ask for last January." He knew the service road, a narrow cut that served a radio tower, and a wind monitor the county refused to replace. The gate had an old camera that fed a shared system, which logged plates and headlights more than faces and worked better than anyone expected. He sent a request through the county portal and asked for January footage from late night hours, and the reply came with a link and a warning about file size. He watched the clips after dinner on the break room monitor because the screen at home had a cracked corner he never fixed. In one clip, the turnout sat dark and empty until a pair of flatbeds eased in like wolves that knew the fence lines. Minutes later, a small hatchback rolled to a stop, hazard lights pulsing a tired heartbeat, and the flatbeds moved as if pulled by the same string. He watched the first driver step out and talk with quick hands, then watched the second driver circle the hatchback like it had a scent. A third vehicle pulled in and stopped behind the hatchback, a high sleeper with long antenna wires and an American flag sticker on the lower door. The hatchback backed away slow, then faster, and left the turnout with the sleeper following, which made the flatbeds idle in place. Next, he watched late January. And this clip hurt because the rain made everything shine like a wet stage where actors forgot their lines. A refrigerated trailer pulled in with smoke from one wheel, a soft gray that looked almost polite until it thickened at the edges. Within minutes, 2 figures worked the hub, one with a small extinguisher, one holding a flashlight, steady and calm, even as the smoke turned rude. The next page of the ledger joined the footage in his mind and made something click that felt like a seatbelt slipping into place. The page listed a night where a driver named Ash met a retired radio man who carried a milk crate of fuses and flagged traffic by feel. It said Ash made it to the next exit and left a case of water behind the rail as thanks, and the radio man refused cash with a stubborn grin. He started to suspect the ledger was not only a list of favors or warnings, but a quiet schedule for kindness that traveled under the grid. The binder clips held more than paper, they held little runs of trust, and a handful of people had decided the turnout would be a tiny town square. He still had to connect the tow crews to something more firm, or at least line up a clean path between names and nights. He reviewed the January footage again, then compared timestamps against dispatch logs, and found a gap where a call had been recorded but then labeled incomplete. The call preview mentioned a shaky voice saying 2 trucks had blocked a lane near mile 32, and another voice saying help was already on the way. The logs showed no county units listed, and the note ended with line dropped, likely lost signal. He printed the clip stills and wrote notes by hand, careful to keep letters large and unhurried because speed ruined more ink than rain. He visited the plaza again and asked Arlene if she knew a retired radio man named Theo, which made her mouth twitch like a bad joke arrived late. She said Theo still came in on Thursdays to trade old surplus radios for stories he liked better than the radios themselves. On Thursday, she waved Evo to a small table near the window where a thin man sat with a canvas cap and a careful breath. Theo looked at the stills without touching them and asked easy questions about wind direction and how long the trucks had stayed put. He read the ledger note photocopy and raised one eyebrow at the refund line where someone had scratched out an unkind word. Theo said, "That book started when we lost a pullout after a washout in 2014 and needed somewhere to map goodwill." He said, "We kept names light on purpose. No addresses, no hero stories, just notes that kept people honest enough to look in the mirror." He added, "I have reported the cruise twice with plates, but the plates led to a rental maze that likes to erase footprints." Ivo asked if Theo would mind adding a line that county maintenance knew the ledger existed, and Theo nodded once like a metronome. He wrote in a tight script, "County eyes know this book and prefer its honesty, no affiliation with any tow company." He slid the pen back with 2 fingers, then told a quick story about a snow chain locker that used to freeze shut and how a hammer can respect stubborn metal without breaking it. The next week, Evo placed a small metal cabinet behind the rail, painted brown like the dirt, no markings, no lock, just a storm latch. Inside, he put rags, coolant, a cheap inflator, and a folded card that said, "Call dispatch and wait if anyone pressures you about towing." The ledger went into the cabinet with its tin, and a note asked writers to close the latch because the wind enjoyed rude jokes. Word spread in the slow way good habits move when they do not ask for attention or applause. Drivers left cleaner notes with times and directions that avoided names, and one traveler wrote a careful line about a black dog that lay near the rail at night to watch tires pass like planets. A deputy added, quietly and without badge number, that a new camera watched the mile 32 shoulder from an angle the crews did not expect. In early summer, a box truck driver named Kelda wrote about a man who flagged her down and pointed to a soft tire, then asked for cash. She wrote, "I offered water and a phone call, and he left without names," and a second car watched from the shadow near the sign. 2 days later, someone wrote, "Gray sedan again, park lights off, backed away when 2 vehicles pulled in together. Report filed at the substation." The plaza cashier taped a simple note near the register that said, "Tow authorization is free by county phone. Ask before you pay anyone." The retired radio man drew a small map to the turnout for a college kid hauling a couch and told him to rest his brakes in the shade because patience kept families alive. The kid returned a week later and left a bag of chips and a soft drink in the cabinet with a note that said, "Thanks for the air." Evo felt the road change by inches, the way a river shifts after a downed tree moves just enough to stop a hidden whirl. He still checked bolts and reflectors. He still swept glass after fender kisses. He still logged storms the way farmers count clouds. He also read the ledger when the latch stuck, and he understood that small tools, shared quietly, can be stronger than loud plants. In late summer, a line appeared in a new hand, careful and slow, as if the writer wanted the words to stand up straight. It said, "Two trucks tried a price on a young couple in a silver van near mile 32 last night. Another driver blocked and called." It ended, deputies arrived, reportedly took reports, crews left before plates could be confirmed, camera angle improved view. Ivo printed that line for the deputy and handed over the catalyst chain he had assembled, which was not a case file, just a path. The deputy said thanks without a smile and later called to say a larger investigation had opened that spanned beyond their stretch of quiet hills. He did not ask for the ledger, and he did not tell Ivo to stop watching. He only asked that the book stay clean of full names to protect decent people. The turnout kept breathing in its slow way, heat riding off gravel in visible waves that made everything wobble and dreamlike. The ledger pages grew soft at the corners, and someone glued reinforced strips to the spine with care that matched the first handwriting. Now and then, a new driver wrote a sentence that sounded grateful for a simple jug of water left by a stranger with a pencil. A local professor left a note about starting a small roadside history project and asked if anyone minded a photocopy at the library. Theo wrote yes, but keep the copy without names, use dates written as words, and call it the Mile 37 book. The library later displayed a scan that showed a landscape of small trades and warnings, nothing dramatic, just a community stitched by traffic and time. Ivo stopped keeping his own separate notes once the system felt stable enough to grow without him tugging at every thread. He still checked the cabinet latch, still wiped dust off the tin, still tightened bolts with gloves that smelled like oil. And Sunday, he understood the ledger worked because it was specific but humble, and because no one wanted ownership beyond a steady line and clear daylight. When the wind came down from the ridge and the pines whispered like a big crowd that agreed on the same joke, the turnout looked ordinary. It still hid a storage of rags and coolant. It still held a book with entries written in hands that learned patience from asphalt. It still sat 3 miles past the crest, where trucks let their brakes breathe, and people learned to slow down enough to see one another. He remembered the first time he had levered the tin from the dust, felt the weight of words that did not need a speech. He thought about the winter calls, the quick hands at the hub, the quiet driver who blocked a box and made the math different. He thought about how a secret can be a responsibility more than a thrill, and how some secrets work best when shared carefully and left mostly unremarked. Arlene kept handing out maps and sandwiches, the cashier kept teasing drivers about their sweet tooth, and Theo kept trading radios for stories he liked better. The deputy kept watching Mile 32 from an angle that made crews uncomfortable, and the plaza lights kept throwing a honey glow across damp pavement after late rain. The road kept moving people who carried every kind of trouble and hope inside their glove boxes and on their dashboards. The ledger held a few blank pages that looked like future mornings and late nights, and the latch kept closing with a soft click. Travelers kept adding lines that sounded like a handshake, and the turnout kept holding small proof that strangers can decide to be neighbors. The book did not stop every scheme, but it hurt the margins enough that different plans made more sense than the old fast money ones. Ivo still checked the culvert after storms, still measured sediment against last season, still logged a snake sighting when a thicket rattled like loose change. He knew the ledger would change hands again eventually, not because he wanted it, but because the road decides and the people follow. He trained a new hire to watch for bolts that work loose and told him that some fixes start with a pencil and a jar. If anyone asked why the turnout mattered, he would point to the cabinet and the scrub pines and the clean lines of the rail. He would say that a book of simple favors became a ledger of safety, and that safety looked ordinary until you added up the lines. He would not mention names, and he would not tell a single hero story, because none of it needed that kind of shine. The highway kept its stubborn rhythm, and the ledger kept its quiet balance, and both felt honest in a way that made sense. The secret was not really a secret anymore, not to the people who needed it and respected what it asked. It asked for neat lines, shared tools, clear times, and the courage to arrive with hazards on and no need for applause. The ferry passenger who never disembarked at Sitka. On a cool morning in Sitka, port workers watched a ferry ease through Sitka Sound while gulls traced slow circles overhead. The vessel's horn rolled over water that smelled of kelp and diesel and early rain. Among the manifested arrivals, one name would reportedly remain unanswered at the terminal doors. People wheeled bags across wet pavement while radio traffic clicked and paused around the ramp. The absence did not ring alarms first, it only lingered as a missing footstep in a practiced routine. The passenger, listed as Charles Weaver, was 62, a retired accountant from Spokane traveling to Sitka to visit his younger sister. He had boarded at Juneau 2 nights earlier, carrying one rolling suitcase and a canvas daypack. A purser noted his quiet demeanor and a habit of reading schedules taped beside stairwells. State records list his height, his gray hair, and an emergency contact with a Washington area code. His purpose in Sitka was simple. He planned to help arrange minor repairs at a family rental. The crew roster that week included a junior deckhand named Ian, 27, who worked nights cleaning rails and checking life rings. He remembered a man matching Weaver's description standing alone near the stern during the long run south. The wind carried spray and conversation toward the cafeteria, where lights stayed warm through the small hours. Some travelers slept against windows, while others played cards near vending machines that hummed against the bulkhead. Ian said he noticed the man review a folded map, then pocket it when the aisle cleared. Dispatch logs from the terminal record the arrival time at dawn, with light rain sweeping across Baranof Island. The ramp grounded against the apron, and trucks rolled off while several pedestrians gathered under a metal awning. A clerk scanned barcodes as passengers filed past a yellow line where a guard checked random bags. The logs show a brief power flicker in the terminal hall, then a reset that lasted under 1 minute. No incident codes were assigned, and operations resumed without delay or comment. Weaver's sister reached the terminal late after a stalled school zone detour near Sawmill Creek Road. She parked near the chain-link fence and watched the last pedestrians scatter toward taxis and waiting relatives. By her account, the rain slowed and a mist sat low across Crescent Harbor. She checked her phone and called twice. Without success, the calls rang without answer, and times were stamped in her provider records. She later told officers she felt uneasy without any specific reason beyond a silence that extended past habit. When baggage carts emptied, a single gray suitcase circled on the belt with no claimant stepping forward to lift it away. The tag matched Weaver's name and routing, printed in black on a laminated slip. A terminal agent moved the suitcase behind a counter and wrote a simple note on a clipboard. No alarm was triggered because unclaimed luggage appears with predictable frequency on rainy mornings. The agent set the suitcase on a shelf and returned to help a couple searching for a misplaced fishing rod. Archived notes taken that afternoon indicate officers spoke separately with two travelers who remembered a man fitting the description. One was an art teacher from Sitka who sketched whales from the solarium during the night hours. She recalled the man leaning on the rail near Mount Edgecombe's faint outline when clouds parted for a moment. Another was a mechanic from Ketchikan who said the same man bought coffee twice and asked about taxi prices in town. Investigators never confirmed the timing with receipts, and no surveillance covered the solarium benches. The county file from 2009 in a separate missing traveler case shows a similar pattern of unclaimed baggage and unclear disembarkation. That earlier file included a ferry manifest, a terminal sweep, and door checks against wind gusts that sometimes move latches. It also noted how passengers occasionally exit through service doors when following crew in reflective jackets. In that instance, the traveler was located later at a motel near a cannery road after walking away in heavy rain. Investigators compared the patterns, yet the Sitka details failed to line up cleanly. Ferry officers reviewed internal access logs for closed stairwells that connect vehicle decks and passenger spaces. They found no anomalies, only routine entries by maintenance staff checking bilge alarms and a cleaner replacing paper towels. A camera near the cafeteria recorded partial views of faces during meal hours but missed the corridor leading to the aft lounge. Reviewers watched the files twice and logged timestamps at 5-minute intervals to mark movement clusters. Some locals claimed an extra gap appeared near the end of the recording, yet technicians reported no dropped frames. At midweek, state records show officers walked the shoreline on both sides of the terminal looking for disturbed kelp lines. The tide had fallen quickly after the ferry's docking, leaving slick rocks and sand flecked with broken shells. They checked ladders, pilings, and fenders for fibers or scuffs that might indicate contact with clothing or bags. A harbor patrol boat swept the inner channel while rain stiffened from the south and visibility narrowed along the hills. Nothing turned up beyond a hat band caught on a cleat that belonged to someone else. Weaver's phone connected briefly to a tower outside town at a time that conflicted with the expected walk-off window. Analysts plotted pings against ferry timetables and decided the reading could reflect device drift under poor weather. A later attempt to triangulate from neighboring towers gave no additional certainty for the immediate period following docking. The device never registered a data session in Sitka proper, and voicemail remained unchanged for several days. The phone was eventually found powered down inside the gray suitcase held behind the terminal counter. When officers opened the suitcase with the sisters' consent, they found clothing folded tightly and a small bottle of vitamins. There was also a spiral notebook with mileage notes and simple arithmetic tracking gas costs for earlier segments of travel. A handwritten list named tasks in Sitka, including a visit to a plumbing supplier and a stop at a family storage unit. Nothing suggested immediate plans beyond errands that fit a short visit. The day pack remained missing, and no one recalled seeing it after the ship's cafeteria closed for the night. A taxi dispatcher reportedly checked logs and found no record of a pickup under Weaver's name during the docking hour. Drivers sometimes accept cash riders who wave at the curb, which complicates documentation on wet mornings when lines are short. One driver remembered a man stepping toward the curb, then turning away while fastening his jacket. The driver could not establish the face, and weather limited the view through the windshield that kept fogging despite the fan. The report noted the uncertainty without assigning weight, and the lead stayed open. Some locals claimed the man left the ship early through a service door when the deckhands repositioned chocks around wheel wells. Crew statements conflicted on door status because procedures allow short openings during shifts and quick closures afterward. A safety officer said those doors close against air pressure that resists casual pushes from the outside. He added that wind can trick hinges and create sounds that resemble latches when traffic moves on the ramp. Investigators never confirmed external access during that window, and the theory remained a line in the file. Searchers walked the footpath toward Totem Park, checking benches and thickets where travelers sometimes paused to adjust bags. Rain lifted briefly, and a weak sun set bands of silver across Sitka Sound, while ravens scolded from cedar branches. A groundskeeper reported no new camps or discarded bottles that would suggest a hasty stop. Officers spoke with staff at a nearby cafe who said the morning trade moved quickly with fishermen and hospital employees. No one recalled a man drip drying near the heater or holding a map with ferry schedules. The sister called relatives in Washington and asked about any change of plans that might redirect the visit. None were reported, and bank activity remained consistent with a careful traveler who used small cash purchases along the route. A credit card charge at Juneau showed a ferry cafeteria meal during a schedule break between legs. There were no Sitka charges and no attempts at withdrawals from machines that dripped onto the pavement near the lot. The pattern suggested momentum towards Sitka, then a full stop without financial movement afterward. Investigators checked hospitals and clinics for admissions matching Weaver's age and description during the week after arrival. No patient aligned with his file, and air ambulance logs listed unrelated cases tied to remote villages and fishing accidents. The harbor master distributed a brief notice to smaller docks asking attendants to report unattended bags. A trooper walked through a gear shop and asked about any customer who seemed lost or wet beyond the usual rain. Staff could not connect the details to a specific person, and the inquiry ended without a lead. A month later, a hiker on a trail above the Indian River claimed to see a jacket sleeve tangled near a root. Officers climbed the slope and found a torn piece of nylon that had weathered through 2 storm cycles. Fabric comparators could not match the weave to Weaver's clothing because the suitcase sample lacked similar material. The location strained the timeline given the docking hour and the limited paths out of the terminal. The note entered the file under unverified observation and did not change the working summary. When analysts wrote their concluding memo, they listed elements that aligned with a simple failure to disembark through the usual doors. They paired those with elements that resisted such a reading, including the phone found later with no tower contact in Sitka. They added a paragraph on ferry architecture and how movement patterns complicate any reconstruction when cameras leave gaps between spaces. A final section summarized the sister's persistent calls and her quiet visits to the shoreline in the weeks following. The memo ended with language indicating records conflict and that the absence remains without a confirmed path. Years later, the terminal agent remembered the morning every time an unclaimed bag circled the belt after a rainy docking. The memory did not carry definitive images, only small impressions tied to radio clicks and the short flicker in the hall. State records continued to list Weaver as missing, with a note that he was last associated with a scheduled ferry arrival. The file stayed active in annual audits and drew brief attention whenever travelers asked about old cases related to the route. Nothing further emerged, and the routine at the dock moved on with gulls and diesel and rain. The stories. Why this motel room safe changed everything. They called it a budget motel along a long highway spur where road dust gathered in corners and secrets settled quietly. The room safe in number 12 looked ordinary enough, powder-coated steel with a keypad that beeped politely at tired travelers. Lyle Garza woke before sunrise on a Tuesday, 38 years old, and working claims for a regional insurer. He had driven 3 hours to meet a policyholder whose pickup had burned behind the old diner, and he wanted clean paperwork today. He checked into the motel first, showered fast, then laid out forms on the dresser, careful about matching VIN digits and timestamps. His plan was simple: wrap the inspection before lunch, then circle back for photos and voice notes after the truck release. He liked driving while the day still felt open, and he told himself the assignment would be routine and forgettable. It had been forgettable until the manager knocked. 2 quick raps, then a pause heavy enough to make him frown. Mara Quintero stood in the doorway with a clipboard, 34, managing rooms and payroll while raising her nephew after school. She asked if he had heard the beeps from the safe, because front desk saw brief power spikes last night. Lyle said he had not used the safe, and she nodded, eyes moving toward the keypad like someone checking a stove twice. Maintenance had logged an odd complaint the previous afternoon. Reportedly, a guest in 12 claimed the safe ate his wallet. The man left before checkout, promising to call the card companies, and a note in the margin said possible intoxication. Mara said housekeeping later pulled the bedding and found a small metal tool near the baseboard. Lyle picked up the tool carefully with a tissue, a thin square of steel with a notch like a feeler gauge. He set it on the desk with his forms, then opened his voice recorder, speaking in that steady tone he used for field notes. He described the room, the safe brand, the tool, and the time on the microwave clock because simple details held steady on lonely days. Mara asked if he knew how to clear the safe code since the master sheet had gone missing during renovations last winter. He did not, but he knew the trick of powering off consumer locks, which could flip hidden defaults, according to a warehouse supervisor he once interviewed. He unplugged the mini fridge, found the breaker panel behind a painting, then asked permission to shut the room briefly. They stood in the doorway while the lights flickered and the highway hummed like a restless air conditioner beyond the lot. He waited 10 seconds, restored power, then tapped the keypad with a ballpoint, feeling silly and a little curious. The safe beeped twice in a lower tone, which he recognized from a training video about apartment lockouts, reportedly used by traveling warranty teams. He tried a factory code that someone had once mumbled during a fire inspection, and the safe chirped, green light winking. The door opened an inch against a sticky seal, and Mara let out a nervous laugh, surprised and worried in equal measure. Inside sat a clear zipper pouch with a folded receipt, a motel keycard from another town, and a small black voice recorder. He found a driver loyalty card attached to the receipt, and he read the printed name softly without repeating it twice. The dates lined up with last week in neat columns, and the purchase list looked like roadside dinners between midnight and 2. He asked Mara if the guest from yesterday had paid cash, and she nodded, then reached for the phone to check archived calls. The front desk handset kept scratchy tapes by default, a habit from the previous owner who never trusted software invoices. She played a call stamped at 2 in the morning, where a tired voice asked for room 12, mentioning a late delivery and stiff back. Another call at 2:30 asked about vending, and a third at 4 asked if nobody would bother him until noon. Lyle switched to evidence mode, careful and methodical, letting his coffee cool while he cataloged the pouch contents. He photographed the safe before moving anything, then called his supervisor to report an unexpected discovery unrelated to the truck claim. The supervisor told him to act reasonably and preserve anything with identifiable information, then to keep his focus on the scheduled inspection. He listened to the voice recorder after asking Mara to stay within earshot, since 2 listeners felt wiser than one on strange mornings. The first file held roadway noise, then a quiet tone of someone rehearsing directions, same room number repeated like a sticky thought. The second file was shorter, a man saying he could not keep doing this and that she would understand once it was delivered safely. He paused to note the words safely, which felt pointed given the open door and the blinking keypad. He bagged the recorder in a zip bag from his kit, then checked the keycard from the other town, which was stamped with a lion logo. Mara recognized the chain and said there was a property 30 miles north, mostly used by truckers and medical travelers. He returned the room to normal and headed for the burned truck with his camera bag, but his plan had started to wobble. The pickup sat behind a towing yard fence, soot clinging thick to the firewall, while melted wires drooped like tired ivy. He worked the usual grid of photos, then the odometer and the cargo bed, then cross-reference with dispatch notes he had requested by email. The fire report smelled like common engine loss, not sabotage, and he felt relief settle along his shoulders as the cause narrowed. He dictated measurements and closed the laptop, then looked at his watch and thought about the safe again and the trembling voice. He felt a nudge of duty that had nothing to do with premiums, and he drove back to the motel through heat that made the road shimmer. Mara met him with a printout of last night guests, which listed an alias that matched the loyalty card name partly. The address field showed a mail drop location, familiar to freight drivers who rolled through without a fixed base. She said a long white tractor had idled near the ice machine last night, according to a neighbor who called about fumes after midnight. He asked for the neighbor number, then listened to a careful woman describe a man in a reflective jacket with a limp. She said he stayed near room 12 door, not inside, as if waiting for someone to arrive quietly or leave quickly. She heard two quiet knocks around 3, and a soft voice answered, then a cart rattle like someone moving luggage without wheels. Lyle opened the pouch again and noticed a handwritten code on the receipt back, 4 digits and a messy star next to it. He tried the code on the safe, and the delay light flashed, which often meant an old user lockout or a wrong sequence. He snapped a photo and lowered the door, then rolled the notched tool between his fingers, a weight that felt borrowed from someone patient. He thought about a repairman he had interviewed in 2019 who taught him that thieves love patterns more than courage. The man said patterns live in receipts, tolls, and vending logs because tired people seek familiar sandwiches and coffee brands. Lyle searched the loyalty program website on his phone, typed the partial name and 4 digits, and got a generic profile with travel points. The profile showed recent redemptions listed by city, and he wrote them on a notepad, then drew lines between dates and approximate routes. The cities formed a loop around distribution centers, with brief pauses near hospitals and bulk pharmacy hubs according to public maps. He felt his heart step faster as the voice recorder line about delivered safely nudged his thoughts toward the quiet side of medicine. He told Mara he would drive north to the Lion Logo Motel for a quick visit, and she insisted on calling ahead politely. The clerk up there skimmed her stay sheets and mentioned a forgotten envelope last week found under a mattress frame during turnover. The envelope held nothing when housekeeping retrieved it, but a corner showed marks from a rubber band, reportedly stretched tight. He reached the northern property by mid-afternoon, watched trucks rock gently in wind, and asked for the manager on duty. A tall man with tired eyes met him in the lobby, said a nurse had asked about a lost pouch 3 nights ago. She wore a badge from a staffing agency, spoke quickly, and left a number that went to voicemail full by morning. The manager allowed a quick look at the lost and found cabinet, which contained phone chargers, a chipped mug, 3 lanyards, and a plastic bag with an empty pharmacy sticker peeled halfway. Lyle photographed the bag and wrote the former label number carefully, then stepped into the parking lot to call a friend in compliance he trusted. The friend checked a public database of recalls and shortages, then told him to consider the rise in small clinical thefts along transport corridors. He returned to his car and replayed the second audio file, hearing the way the man swallowed hard between sentences. The phrase delivered safely stuck again, and he wondered if safely meant to someone specific, not to a warehouse or anonymous shelf. He drove back to the first motel with a plan forming, not quite a theory, but a set of steps that could either untangle or embarrass him. He asked Mara for permission to review last week camera footage that covered the breezeway near room 12, and she agreed. The feed was old, grainy, and stamped with the wrong date, since nobody reset it after storms in 2015. Still, silhouettes moved clearly enough. And at 3:12, a figure in a reflective jacket appeared with a short, careful stride. The figure waited near the door, then crouched to slide something under, then stood fast as another figure approached from the stairwell. The second person carried a rolling cart with a blanket thrown over, which hung low enough to hide a small cooler shape. They exchanged a short handshake, then rolled the cart toward the soda machine area, where cameras always blinked with static. Lyle paused the frame and sketched the handshake position, because small, consistent gestures tied people to habits when faces stayed hidden. He compared the notebook times to the archived calls, matching the neighbor report with the footage minute stamp nearly exactly. He folded his notes and looked at Mara, who watched quietly with the clipboard held like a shield against a sudden chill. He called the non-emergency line and asked to speak with property crimes, then explained he was an adjuster who found items in a room safe. He said the items might connect to an ongoing pattern, not a single incident, and that he was available to hand them over cleanly. The dispatcher thanked him and routed the call, and he kept his voice steady while explaining that nobody was hurt today. The detective who arrived wore a tie gone soft at the edges. A man who had seen this exact motel a dozen times. He took the pouch, the recorder, and copies of the photos, then asked Lyle to explain the breaker trick and the code attempts. He nodded at the handshake frame and said a group had moved product along back roads for months, staying under dollar thresholds on purpose. Lyle asked quietly if product meant medicine, and the detective said people cut solutions with water and resold to small clinics. In some stories, the clinics were victims with forged orders, and in others, they were partners, trying to stretch short supplies like taffy. The man in the reflector jacket likely ran deliveries for cash while hauling legal freight, which made tracing routes messy and confusing. The detective listened to the voice files twice, then looked at the loyalty redemptions and circled two cities with his pen. He said the phrase delivered safely could mean to a person at a care home who could not pay official prices anymore. The pouch might have served as a drop signal, and the room safe might have held a stopgap in case someone panicked. They took statements from Mara and the neighbor by phone, and the manager at the northern property sent a scanned copy of his notes. The detective collected the notch tool and said it was standard for bypassing cam locks, which matched a series of quiet thefts from vending. He asked Lyle to write a formal summary of his steps, meticulous and dated, and to expect a follow-up if a warrant landed later. Lyle finished the paper part in his room, breathing slow while light crept through the blinds in a warm, tired stripe. He wrote down the way the safe beeped twice after power restoration, which suggested a default that any one patient could eventually find. He wrote the route loop and the hospital adjacency, and he wrote the voice phrasing exactly because transcription mattered when memories warped. He closed his laptop and stared at the open safe like it wanted to be ordinary again, silent and blank and light. He felt that shift people talk about when routine work bends into something it has no business touching on a weekday. He thought about honest clinics, rationing doses, then about someone paying cash at 3 in the morning because a parent cried. At dusk, the detective called back and said a unit found the white tractor idling near a different budget property downtown. The driver had the same chain lanyard from the lost and found cabinet, and his phone contained notes about room safes by brand. He reportedly told officers he was only a messenger and that someone else handled actual swapping and dilution, which sounded flat and practiced. Lyle listened quietly and said he would be available if a deposition request arrived. Then he sat with the keycard on the dresser. He knew he would remember the feel of that notched tool because it had a purpose-built patience that felt personal. He knew he would remember the cheap beep of the safe and the way a single small space changed the line of his day. A week later, he got an email from the detective, brief and measured, thanking him for the timeline and the careful photos. The message said the pouch had traces of saline and a label adhesive compound common to medical packaging of a certain class. The voice on the recorder matched a man pulled over near a way station, according to dispatch logs and an archived booking photo. Lyle drove back to the motel after closing another case, and he asked Mara how business felt since the long Tuesday. She said people still stopped for highway rest, and she tightened a few procedures quietly, preferring to let small changes speak. She now kept master codes in a locked drawer and replaced 3 aging safes with models that logged attempts for a full week. They stood in room 12 a moment, like visitors paying respects to an inanimate witness that never blinked. The safe sat closed and calm, doing exactly what a box was meant to do, which felt both reassuring and strange. He signed the receipt for his stay, then shook her hand, and promised to bring better stories next time through. On the drive home, he thought about the phrase delivered safely again and how words can hide more than they reveal. He wondered how many small transactions keep the world running, good and bad, unremarkable and decisive, stacked behind quiet doors. He decided the safe had not made him heroic or special, it had only reminded him that dull edges can cut when pressure builds. He kept working claims, taking pictures of bent bumpers and damp carpet, writing notes with careful times and plain language. He still believed that truth likes details and that details prefer patient notebooks, not flashy speeches or clever hunches. When he thought about that Tuesday, he did not think about danger or chase lights. He thought about how a box opened and a day veered left. Mara hired another housekeeper and bought a better cart, one that glided without rattling near cameras and soda machines. She laughed more at the front desk now, but her eyes still checked keys and codes before she turned off the lights. She told her nephew that small routines matter, like counting towels and returning clipboards, because order resists the creep of careless luck. The detective moved on to other cases and sent one last note months later, carefully worded, acknowledging ongoing court schedules. He wrote that the room safe discovery had clarified timing between suspects, which helped align witness statements with fuel receipts precisely. He added a line about public hearings scheduled for late next spring, where facts would hopefully land on paper clearly. The motel kept renting room 12 to travelers who wanted ground-level convenience and an easy walk to the ice. The safe held wallets and passports and nothing dramatic for a while, which suited everyone whose name stayed off any report. The highway kept pouring itself past the parking lot, and the night clerk kept coffee hot for anyone who needed comfort. Lyle sometimes thought about stopping by without a claim, just to buy a soda and wave at the office through dusty glass. He pictured the safe blinking quietly in that square of afternoon sun, as if practicing for whatever day came next. He accepted that the box had not changed him completely, but it had polished a habit he already valued deeply. He looked back on it like a narrow bridge he crossed safely, not a legend, just a real span over a quiet creek. He had listened, he had written, he had looked twice, and he had taken small steps that lined up neatly. That felt like enough for a life that preferred steady roads to loud headlines, and it still does. The stories. Night Guard, who followed footprints beyond the bridge. The first prints showed on a cold night when the river smoked and the closed bridge let out a slow iron groan. Frost held the gravel in a crust, so every step someone took across the municipal yard snapped like thin glass. Merrick Holland worked nights because he liked quiet places and because the warehouse paid overtime when storms rolled in. He was 41 by the last week of January, and he kept his thermos on the dash while he did his rounds. His plan was simple that night. Check the north fence. Check the generator shed. Sign the log before dawn and head home on the empty road. He saw the prints on his second pass, and their path made little sense when he stood still to study them. The footprints curved toward the pedestrian bridge that crossed the narrow river, which had been closed since late autumn while crews waited on parts. A chain link panel barred the entrance with a sign that warned about unsafe decking, and Marek knew the sign by heart. He radioed the dispatcher with a routine note, since procedure made repeaters of careful guards. He kept his words easy. He said there were footprints where there should be none, and that he would check closer. The reply was scratchy and bored, and Merrick almost laughed at the familiar tone. The treads were small and tidy, like work boots with a diamond pattern, and each step pressed the frost to a dark oval. The prints went right up to the chain link panel, then slipped under at a low spot where someone had pulled wire loose. Merrick knelt and touched the ground, and cold shot through his glove while he reset the bent ties. He peered down the dark shape of the bridge and decided he would not walk out there in the cold wind, not without telling someone first. He called again, then kept his flashlight tight to the decking while he stepped forward, and he felt the bridge vibrate under his boots. He moved slow because he always moved slow when he could choose between slow and fast. Halfway across, the prints turned to powder as the frost thinned, and he had to scan both sides for scuffs on the gray boards. He found a faint line where grit had dragged, like something heavy had been pulled by rope. On the far side, the deck ended at a set of concrete steps that dropped to the river path, and here the prints deepened again. They pointed left, past an old pipe cradle and a low stand of scrub willow. Reports in the fall had mentioned fishers along the bank after hours, which was normal, and a few had been moved along without trouble. A clerk at the gas station had told an officer that a man bought batteries and duct tape in the same visit, which was normal enough, though people sometimes remember strange details when asked at night. Dispatch logs showed power dips near the intake station from time to time, and maintenance had chalked that up to loose connections in cold weather. Marek followed the prints along the river path until they vanished near a patch of bare gravel that the sun struck most days, even in winter. He stood there and listened. Somewhere upstream, an owl made 3 soft calls, and a semi rolled past on the highway with a roar that shook the willow branches. He decided he had gone far enough for one night. He photographed the prints on his phone and headed back, and he wrote a careful note in the log before dawn. By the next shift, the frost lifted late, and the yard lights burned a clean white circle on the gravel. Merrick checked the generator shed first and noticed something he could not shake. The small lock on the diesel cap was scuffed, and a scratch ran from the cap to the lip like a hose had rubbed while someone steadied a weight. He checked the fuel slip from the last delivery and did the quick math. The level looked low by a few gallons, which could happen, and which also could not. He spoke with Celia Karp in maintenance the following afternoon because Celia knew more about the place than anyone in the office. Celia was 58 and had worked 3 floods and 2 droughts, and she kept a pocket notebook with every code for every panel. She said the power dips had been shrugged off by city, and that nobody had time to pull the panels until spring. She said the bridge closure made her nervous because blocked paths invite shortcuts. On the third night, Marek went to the bridge before his first pass, and he crouched at the chain link panel with a small bag of sidewalk chalk from the supply closet. He rubbed a pinch of red chalk into the dirt under the gap and dusted the decking where the prints had scuffed before. He wanted a way to tell if someone crossed again, and he wanted to see where the dust went when the night did its work. He made his rounds slower than usual and kept his eyes on corners where things hide without trying. The radio remained quiet until midnight. Then a call came in about a coyote by the south gate. Marek drove down and found only wind, and he thought the call felt like a joke he had heard before. He logged it anyway, because logs are the bones of quiet jobs. When he returned to the bridge, his light caught the faintest red sunset on the boards, and he felt alert in the way he liked. The chalk had smeared in a thin line toward the far steps, and the dust trailed down to the river path. On the gravel, small red flecks marked an arc that led behind a stack of old culvert pipe where few people bothered to look. He moved closer and found a cooler wedged inside a culvert mouth, and an inverter buzzed inside like a tired hornet. A length of clear hose lay coiled by the cooler, and the nozzle had a strip of duct tape where a leak had been patched. The setup looked temporary and careful, like someone trusted routine more than luck. Marek called dispatch, and his voice stayed even while he chose words that would not set hairs on necks. An officer drove down the service road and met him by the culvert, and they stood and listened together. The officer did not rush, which Marek respected, and the 2 men watched the bridge until the wind shifted. The officer said he would put a note on the morning brief, and he asked Marek to keep eyes open without playing hero. The phrase made Marek smile, and later he did not tell that part to anyone. In the days after, Marek traced the quiet pattern that repeats when someone abuses access. He checked camera angles and discovered the North Yard camera had been bumped on a date that matched a power dip, and the new angle showed the sky more than the gate. He opened the back of the housing and found 3 screws missing, which was always a tell. He measured the footprints with a scrap of tape and got the same length each time, which told him the walker was careful with steps or else was one person always. He walked to the diner 2 blocks away during the afternoon and chatted with the cook named Huxley, who knew every vehicle that rolled through after midnight. Huxley said a man in a dark jacket sat late 2 nights a week, always with a single cup of coffee and a pocket radio on the booth seat. Huxley said the man tipped exact change and left when the freight trains crossed the river, which happened near the time Marion Street patrol cars swapped shifts. At the yard, a temporary guard from an agency had been filling 2 nights that Mark traded away for overtime on weekends. The temp signed the log with 2 letters and a quick crooked line. The initials were H and P, which matched about 1,000 people and which could match none. Merrick did not care for suspicion as a hobby, yet he did not care for coincidences when fuel levels fell in quiet inches. He sat in his sedan before shift and went through old notes in his glove box where he kept manuals and photocopies. A contractor named Deacon Varelli had lost access in 2017 after a billing fight, and his crew had worked the intake station on that very river path for years. Merrick wrote the name on a small card, then tossed the card at once, because names can lead you down the wrong hall. He kept his attention on the temp schedule instead, and he compared logs against the chalk nights and the reported coyote calls. On a dry Tuesday, red chalk showed again on the gravel, and the cooler in the culvert had moved 2 feet, which looked like a nervous person trying to outsmart the obvious. Marek called the non-emergency number and asked for a quiet presence, and officers waited with their lights low behind the old salt shed. Marek did his rounds with wide loops and checked his watch without seeming to check, and he waited on the near side of the bridge by the chain link panel. A figure came over the crest like a shadow that had business, and the boots set down in precise little ovals. The man wore a dark jacket with reflective piping like the agency issued, and he carried a duffel that sagged from weight. Merrick stepped forward and kept his light on the ground, and he spoke steady without trying to sound like an actor. He said the bridge was closed by order of city, and he asked if help was needed. The man froze and looked left toward the culvert, which told Marek the only thing he really needed to know. The officers stepped from behind the shed, and everything stayed dull and true from there. The duffel held a 12-volt pump, a power bank, and 2 hoses cut to different lengths. The cooler held the inverter and spare tape and a stack of empty hand warmers, which can keep batteries alive just long enough between dips. The generator diesel cap carried the same tape residue as the hose, which tied the loop neatly enough for any careful mind. In the report that later circulated, details sat plain without flourish, which is how such documents talk to the world. The temp guard was named Harley Pruitt, age 36, and he had worked a roster of small night jobs that rewarded boredom more than skill. Archived calls showed he had reported animal movement at the south gate on the nights when the pump likely ran, which kept eyes away from the river path. Store security footage from across the highway reportedly showed a man matching his build, buying duct tape and batteries on a schedule that matched power dips at the intake station. Celia came down with a wrench the following morning and replaced the generator cap, and she tightened every panel on every camera while humming through her teeth. She shook Merrick's hand with hard gratitude, and she told him the thing she always tells the new ones. Quiet places are never empty, and attention is the difference between a close call and a cleanup. People in town talked for a day, and then they talked about weather and games and a boat stuck on the ramp. Merrick logged his shift and ran a cloth across the dusty dash, and he looked once at the bridge where the chain link panel still hung crooked. He felt a small weight lift, which felt almost like pride, and then he felt something more like relief. He went back to the prints in his head, and he ran the path out again from the first night to the last. The steps had led beyond the bridge in the way tracks tell their whole story, and the red chalk had given him a quiet mouth. He thought about the way a small problem can hide inside a larger closure, and how a closed bridge invites someone to think rules are only suggestion. He drove the empty road home before dawn, and the river threw thin fog across the low bend like quiet breath. Merrick did not decide to keep working nights forever, and he did not make any grand vow. He thought instead about the small habits that keep a place honest and the way a single set of prints can reveal a patient plan. In a town that prefers routine, a careful person with time can pull things apart slowly. unless another careful person keeps watch and asks simple questions that carry weight. By spring, the bridge opened again with new planks that smelled like fresh-cut pine, and families leaned on the rail to watch geese slide by. Some people remember a rumor when they cross, while most only hear water and light traffic and the chatter of kids. Merrick crosses when his route calls for it, and he never looks for drama, though he notices scuffs out of habit and checks if gates sit straight. He keeps chalk in the glove box still, and he keeps a small card that reminds him that attention wins more often than luck. The card does not carry a name, and it does not need one, because the lesson was simple and dull and true. He followed footprints beyond a bridge that everyone ignored, and he found a tidy machine made for taking small pieces of a place that trusted silence. Quiet work gave him back a little faith, which is worth more on a night shift than any badge or speech. When people ask him why he noticed, Marek says it was the shape of the morning frost and the numbers that never add fare. He tells them he just kept walking where the prince asked him to go, and he wrote things down when they mattered. He says a bridge is still a path even when closed, and that someone will use that fact to their advantage at least once. The rest of the time, he does not say much, and he lets the town hold its small stories without fuss, because most of them end with someone paying attention and returning what does not belong to them. The stories. These archived tapes were a warning at the lake. The county kept a box of old tapes that nobody requested, though people mentioned a lake in half the labels. Each reel carried a handwritten date in faded ink, spanning from 1984 through 2001, then stopping abruptly. Rena Valdez was 34, a county records technician who covered the public window and handled the backroom shelves. She had planned a quick shift, then a quiet drive to her sister's apartment for leftover stew and television. The box of tapes ruined that plan because the new intern stacked it crookedly and the lid slid open suddenly. One cardboard sleeve read Lake Patrol. Another said Ranger Tower 2. The thickest sleeve said Dispatch Saturdays. A note at the bottom said duplicates for training, reportedly returned after audit, do not discard. The dates matched a period locals still referenced with nervous jokes, which meant details might still identify private people. She logged the box in a generic way, using the Lakeshore District and a wide date range to protect identities. She told herself it would wait until Monday, then she found herself winding a reel on the library machine. The machine clicked softly, and a voice filled the tiny playback room, thin and metallic. The first tape was a ranger briefing about posted signs and seasonal closures, and nothing seemed strange at first hearing. A man listed wind patterns, then a woman read names for volunteer cleanups, and then someone said maintenance reported missing bolts on the north dock. The voice added that the bolts were not stripped, they were removed carefully without damaging the boards. A second tape included a dispatcher answering calls about diesel sheen near the old boat ramp. According to the label, fishermen reported a smell like hot plastic, and a teenager reported chain rattling under the planks after dark. The dispatcher kept people calm while advising them to stick to lit areas and avoid the roped section. Rena paused the machine and wrote notes in her spiral, keeping each line factual with times and initials. She checked the storage log for incident reports from those dates, and the log showed vague entries about routine patrol and no injuries. It seemed like a cluster of small maintenance problems, which did not explain the careful script on the warning sleeves. She switched reels, and a new voice took over, quieter and closer to the microphone. The label said Saturdays 2, with a date from 1991 in shaky handwriting and a stamped number. The voice mentioned archived calls about chain noises again, and added that footprints led down the roped section in soft silt. Someone in the room asked about weather, and the answer was light wind, clear night, no boats scheduled after sunset. The voice then read a memo that asked rangers to log all interactions with a particular vendor near the snack stand. It said, do not escalate, document demeanor, and confirm hours against posted permits, using a separate clipboard. Rena recognized the clipboard instruction style, which matched old county risk templates for potential liability tracking. Vendors generated paperwork when things went sideways, especially near open water with kids, which made steady documentation crucial later. Still, the tapes kept circling the same triangle of dock bolts, chain noises, and the roped section. She printed a map from the binder with blank labels, then drew a tidy triangle between the dock, the snack stand, and the ranger tower. The map helped her visualize lines of sight, and she started marking places with little asterisks for maintenance incidents. The roped section sat slightly east, hidden from the snack stand by cottonwoods, which mattered for visibility. Another reel played a clipped exchange where a ranger told dispatch that a gate lock appeared new and unregistered. The ranger added that cones were moved and a laminated warning sign had clean nail holes without rust. The dispatcher asked for photos, and the answer was already taken and copied for the folder labeled permits. The next tape changed tone with a shaky breath before an officer started reading notes into the recorder deliberately. He said witnesses reported a loud splash near midnight, then a truck engine idling on the far turnout. He said tracks showed heavy tread, then lighter footsteps heading back alone, and a partial plate was recorded without certainty. Rena stopped and checked the case index, trying to locate an incident number referencing a midnight splash during that month. The index only showed a maintenance order for replacing stolen chain and a request for more reflective tape. She underlined the lack of a matching incident and added a small arrow to her running list for later verification. On Tuesday morning, she asked her supervisor if she could inventory the box more thoroughly since the reels were fragile. He nodded without interest, telling her to log whatever needed logging and to shove the box behind tax rolls. That gave her private time in the playback room, which she used to build a timeline on fresh paper. She listened to another Saturday tape where a woman from the tower called dispatch about a boat drifting across the boundary. The boat moved lazily, but the line drifted toward the roped section, which was posted as no entry. The woman sounded firm, and she logged the time. Then she asked for a ranger with a bullhorn. A tiny clink echoed on the tape before a second voice said, "Hold on," then added that a chain was loosened again. The tower watched two shapes, bending by the boundary floats, and the dispatcher repeated the request for immediate response. Sirens filtered faintly through the recorder, then the tape ended with an abrupt click that did not feel accidental. Rena checked the log again and found only a note about routine lake closure with citation for boundary violation. She highlighted the citation number and scribbled a request to pull the paper copy from the offsite cabinet. If the citation sheet had officer notes, she might find names replaced with initials and a vendor detail. In the afternoon, the intern returned with coffee, and Rena asked if he knew the lake from hiking around. He said his cousins called it the turnaround because teens used the far turnout to swap drivers late at night. He said people heard the chain in the wind and joked that it meant a shift change for the lake. She asked about the vendor by the snack stand, and he shrugged, saying an older guy sold bait from a cooler. He added that the man kept to himself and that the stand closed after 2003 when bathrooms needed repair. Rena thanked him, then went back to the machine, because one more reel had Ranger Tower 2 in heavy ink. The reel opened with playful teasing about coffee. Then a woman said the boundary floats were drifting again toward the shallow shelf. She made a note that the vendor stayed late, counting cash, and that 3 pickup trucks idled by the turnout. She said wind from the ridge pushed small waves against the dock posts, and the sound carried. Then came a gentle thud, and the woman said quietly that bolt heads were missing again on the north ladder. She asked anyone nearby to bring a camera and mentioned small shavings near the posts, like metal caught and ground shiny. She said it looked new, not weathered, and suggested logging it as tampering after checking permits. Rena wrote ladder bolt heads missing and circled the phrase carefully, then drew a line to the earlier chain note. She felt the outline of something organized, not merely bad luck, and the tapes added a pattern of late Saturdays. She felt a pinch of frustration, because the official paper trail looked deliberately harmless compared to the recordings. She filed a request to review tower logs that year, and the clerk gave her a battered binder with loose pages. The tower logs used pencil, and the Saturday pages looked smudged, but several entries repeated a vendor name pattern. The pattern matched the earlier instruction to log demeanor and hours, which meant quiet escalation without confrontation. An evening tape from 2001 began with static. Then the dispatcher said the tower line would record summaries every hour. The tower voice read weather, then listed vehicles, then paused at a truck with a partially obscured plate covered by dust. The tower added that the truck bed held a heavy chain coiled flat and the ends taped tight. Rena felt the air in the room go thin, though she knew she was just listening to old caution collected for audits. The tower voice kept going, steady and calm, calling out two sets of footsteps and one pair returning alone toward the turnout. Then the tower said the vendor appeared nervous, closing early and locking a cooler with a new padlock. Another reel documented a ranger walking the roped section at dawn, taking photos of raw scrapes on chain links. The ranger said the scrapes were bright, not dull, and the boundary floats had new gouges near the welded rings. He guessed someone had dragged the chain to the shelf, making deep channels beside the ladder posts. She studied the map again, measuring distances with the edge of a note card and aligning the triangle to the shoreline. The shelf sat where the cold current ran channel to channel, sucking down loose gear and stunned fish every spring. If someone knew that flow, they could use it to hide things quickly, maybe even move something heavy without splashing. The county maintained a box of anonymous tips from that period, and Rena requested the file through the clerk quietly. The tips mentioned fights in the turnout, and a truck with fresh dents, and late-night cash counting by the stand. One tip described a crying woman near the chain in 1991, then wrote, "He told her to get in now." Rena breathed slowly and kept her notes clinical, because she was not a detective and the tapes were not a case file. She wrote potential domestic dispute near boundary, then wrote check for missing persons in overlapping county dates. She cross-referenced the years against a public list of unresolved reports, without printing names or addresses. Within that public list, several families had posted memorial pages that mentioned the lake vaguely without pinning a location. The dates brushed the Saturday span, and at least one message thanked volunteers who had searched old drainage channels. Rena did not draw conclusions, but she felt the box had been kept near the window for a reason. The thickest reel contained a training segment that sounded like a quiet warning wrapped as procedure. A supervisor read instructions for dock inspections, then emphasized that bolts should be numbered and painted once installed. He said repeated substitutions by outside contractors had caused confusion, then urged rangers to photograph every ladder each week. He read slowly, reminding staff to check chain markings and to log any bright scrapes within 24 hours. He asked that vendor interactions stay cordial but detailed, and that cash counts should match posted hour sheets precisely. He repeated that night closures had reasons, and that the roped section protected a shelf known for unpredictable suction. The tape ended with a short statement that felt heavier than a standard sign-off, even to someone outside enforcement work. The supervisor said the lake keeps receipts, and he called tape steel a kind of ledger if you knew how to read. He then asked that all summaries be placed in the Saturday binder, followed by a written note in the permit folder. Rena returned the reels to their sleeves, then updated the entry in the inventory system with a quiet summary. She wrote that the contents included dispatch summaries, tower logs, and training instructions, and that these might interest risk management. She flagged the box for restricted copying and added a line suggesting improved storage due to evidentiary value. That night, she drove to the lake and parked by the official overlook, staying within the open hours like a normal visitor. The water looked glossy and harmless, and a steady breeze shoved new leaves across the shore in rattling waves. Families packed up coolers, while a ranger checked the rope line and reset a slack float with a practice tug. She walked the path between the tower and the snack stand, then down to the dock where the ladder bolts gleamed. They were painted red, and small numbers were stamped into the heads, which suggested a new practice after the tapes. A sign near the rope read "No entry, shelf unstable," and the letters were bold without clutter. A man in a lake crew shirt saw her taking photos and asked if she needed anything, and she said just admiring. He nodded and said they had redone the hardware, then added that the chain had been upgraded to a heavier gauge. He pointed out a new anchor a few yards deeper where the current used to pull and said it cost plenty. She asked if the improvements followed a particular incident, and he smiled without offering details, then looked toward the tower. He said the lake gets busier every year, and they prefer keeping rules friendly and simple to help everyone. He wished her a good evening and kept walking, tapping each cleat along the dock with a small hammer. At her desk the next morning, she wrote one final paragraph for the internal memo, careful with every single word. She explained that the tapes documented a pattern of weekend tampering around a hazardous shelf with persistent chain disturbances. She wrote that witnesses described idling trucks and partial plates, and that tower logs flagged a vendor for careful tracking. She recommended digitizing the reels, then filing them with risk management as potential warnings that improved current safety practices. She attached her timeline and map using initials and generic labels to avoid identifying anyone who might still live nearby. She kept her tone neutral because the point was preservation, not drama, and the tapes already carried weight. Before sealing the memo, she added a small line that explained how the tapes worked like a quiet lighthouse. They glowed in the dark of back rooms, keeping watch over a place that looked relaxed but demanded attention. They did not accuse anyone directly, but they pointed toward the triangle where the water kept its swift accounting. She delivered the memo to her supervisor, who skimmed it, then set it aside for the weekly folder without comment. He asked if the reels were labeled securely, and she said yes, and he nodded and said, "Good, thank you." The box returned to the shelf, but the entry now carried a bright strip indicating restricted handling under department guidance. A week later, risk management requested digital transfers, citing an internal review of seasonal safety procedures for public areas. They noted that the dock hardware had improved and that the chain layout matched new engineering reports after recent surveys. They asked for any additional recordings from surrounding years to complete their context for training material. Rena stayed out of that conversation because her role stopped at preservation, though she felt a calm sense of completion. The Saturday binder had finally spoken in full sentences, and everything pointed toward the same quiet conclusion. The tapes were a warning written in small sounds that added up to a clear map of careful harm. When she finally visited her sister that weekend, the stew tasted warm, and the apartment felt crowded with plants. She described none of the lake details, only saying she liked hearing old voices explain rules that still mattered today. Her sister laughed and said she had always loved rule followers because they were the ones who kept doors from sticking. In the months that followed, the dock signs stayed bright, the chains stayed tight, and the roped section kept its distance. Families watched sunsets without wandering across the floats, while rangers checked the ladder bolts and stamped numbers. A new plaque near the overlook said thank you to volunteers for years of safe seasons without naming anyone specifically. People told stories anyway, because lakes attract stories, and most were harmless and not entirely accurate. Rena preferred the tapes because they never chased drama and they always returned to measured facts. They cared about footprints on silt and bright scrapes on metal and the way a current can tell time. If someone asked her privately why a box of tapes mattered, she offered a simple answer without personal detail. The lake taught the staff to listen for small patterns, and the tapes taught the staff to write them down. Warnings are not always loud, and sometimes they arrive as quiet instructions that keep strangers safe. She thought of the supervisor who said the lake keeps receipts, and she believed him without needing a name or headline. The water gave back bolts and shavings and slack rope, and the staff learned to read that ledger patiently. In that way, the old Saturday voices kept working, guiding hands without demanding attention or applause. By the next summer, the tower logged more visitors and fewer citations, and the vendor stand sold cold drinks, not bait. The chain still hummed on windy nights, but people heard it as a plain boundary, not a rumor. The tapes stayed in climate storage, digitized and labeled, a warning preserved as training rather than tragedy. When the county finally archived the memo with the transfer receipts, Rena slid a copy into her personal binder. She liked the neatness of an ending that did not demand a dramatic reveal, only patient steps that matched evidence. The lake did not need a ghost, it needed attention, and those tapes had asked for it many years ago. She drove by the overlook after work one evening, watching the sun burn down into a clean line on the water. A ranger tapped the cleats again, just like before, and the chain lay tight and bright across the current. The triangle she drew on paper felt like a familiar shape in her mind, precise and ordinary, and finally understood.